Captain Jason Miller kicked the janitor's cleaning cart across the hangar floor and laughed as the mop clattered against the wheel of a $40 million fighter jet. "Get your trash away from my aircraft, lady," he sneered while Emily Carter knelt to pick up the spilled water without a word. The younger pilots howled. Not one of them knew they'd just humiliated the greatest combat pilot America ever produced. Before we go further, if this story moves you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, so I can see just how far Emily's story has traveled. Emily Carter picked up the mop. She didn't look at the young man who had kicked her cart. She didn't look at the four other pilots leaning against the hangar wall, laughing with their arms crossed. Their flight suits still zipped down to the waist like they wanted the whole world to know they'd just come off a training run. She simply reached down, wrapped her fingers around the wooden handle, and set the cart upright again. Water had pooled across the polished concrete, and she pulled a rag from her back pocket and began to soak it up, moving in slow, patient circles. "You believe this," Jason Miller said to the others. "She's still cleaning it, like nothing happened." "Maybe she likes it," another pilot said. His name was Ryan Cole, and he was 26 years old, and he had never in his life been shot at. "Maybe this is the most excitement she's had all week." They laughed again. Emily kept wiping. There was a time, and it felt like it belonged to another woman entirely, when Emily Carter would have had a response for a man like Jason Miller. A time when a comment like that would have earned him a stare that made grown officers straighten their backs. But that woman had been buried a long time ago, buried under a gray maintenance uniform in a name tag that just said Carter, in block letters, buried under years of quiet mornings in quiet hallways, in the deliberate, disciplined choice to be nobody at all. So she said nothing. She wrung out the rag into the bucket, and she stood and she pushed her cart toward the far end of the hangar where the light was dimmer and the young men couldn't see her face. Because if they had seen her face, they might have noticed something. They might have noticed the way her eyes moved across the F-35 as she passed it, the way they traced the leading edge of the wing and the intake and the seam of the canopy, reading the machine, the way a mother reads the face of her own child. They might have noticed that she wasn't looking at the jet the way a janitor looks at a jet. She was looking at it the way a pilot looks at something she used to love. But nobody was looking at Emily. Nobody ever looked at Emily. That was the whole point. Raven Peak Air Force Base sat high in the Colorado mountains, close enough to the sky that on some mornings the clouds came down and swallowed the runway whole. It was a training base, mostly a place where young pilots came to earn their wings and their arrogance in roughly equal measure. And for the last 4 years, Emily Carter had cleaned its floors. She arrived every morning at 5. She parked her old truck in the far corner of the lot, the corner nobody wanted because it was the longest walk, and she clocked in, and she pushed her cart down corridors that were still dark and still empty. She liked the base best when it was empty. She liked the sound of the mop against the tile, the hum of the fluorescent lights warming up the distant thunder of the first jets going up at dawn. There was a peace in it. A person could disappear into work like that, could let the hours carry her from one end of the day to the other without ever having to be anyone. That was what Emily wanted, to not be anyone. She had wanted it for 4 years, and for 4 years she had gotten it, and she had told herself that was enough. "Morning, Emily." The voice belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the communications specialist, a woman in her early 30s with a coffee in one hand and a stack of folders in the other. Sarah was one of the few people on base who spoke to Emily like she was a human being instead of a piece of the furniture. Emily had never asked her why. She suspected Sarah was just the kind of person who couldn't walk past somebody without saying hello. "Morning," Emily said. "You see the schedule, big training, today, half the wings going up." Sarah shifted the folders under her arm. "Weather's supposed to hold, at least that's what they're telling us." Emily stopped pushing her cart. She looked toward the tall windows at the end of the corridor, out at the gray line of the mountains and the sky above them. And for a moment, something crossed her face that Sarah didn't understand. "Weather won't hold," Emily said. Sarah blinked. "What?" "There's a front coming in from the northwest. You can see it in the way the cloud deck's stacking up over the ridge. By early afternoon, you'll have wind shear on the approach. Bad kind, the kind that lies to you." Emily said it plainly, the way a person states the time of day, and then she seemed to catch herself, and she looked down at her cart and her face closed like a door. "But what do I know? I just pushed the mop." Sarah stared at her. "How did you—" She started, and then she stopped because Emily was already walking away, already pushing her cart around the corner and out of sight, and the question died in Sarah's mouth. Sarah stood there a long moment in the empty corridor. She looked out at the mountains and the cloud deck stacking up over the ridge, and she tried to see what Emily had seen, and she couldn't. It just looked like sky to her. Gray, ordinary sky. But she wrote it down anyway. Wind shear northwest, front afternoon. She didn't know why. She just had a feeling that when a woman said something like that in a voice like that, a person ought to write it down. By 8 o'clock, the hangar was loud with life. Crew chiefs shouted over the whine of auxiliary power units. Pilots swaggered out to their aircraft with their helmets tucked under their arms. And Emily Carter moved through the edge of all of it, invisible, pushing her cart, emptying the trash bins, wiping down the coffee machine in the ready room, while men who had never flown a day in real combat argued about who was the better stick. I'm telling you, Jason Miller was saying, his boots up on a chair, the sim doesn't lie. My scores are the best in the class. Second best isn't even close. The sim isn't real, Jace, said Ryan Cole. It's realer than anything you've done. Jason grinned. He was handsome in the way that young men who have always been told they're special are handsome, all confidence and no weather in his eyes. You know what real combat is? Real combat is the sim plus fear, and I don't have any fear. So, Emily wiped the counter. She didn't react. She had learned over 4 years how to make her face into a thing that gave nothing back. But inside, something turned. Not anger exactly, something sadder than anger. She had known men like Jason Miller. She had flown with men like Jason Miller. And she had watched more than once what happened to men like Jason Miller when the sky finally stopped being a sim and became the thing that could kill you. She had watched the fear arrive in their eyes for the first time at 19,000 feet, where it was too late to learn how to carry it. She had held a man's hand once through a radio as the fear took him, had talked to him all the way down, had kept her voice steady and warm and calm until the very last second when the radio went to static and stayed there. She wiped the counter. You okay there, sweetheart? Jason said, noticing her for the first time. You look a little lost. Bathroom's that way. The other pilot snickered. Emily set down her rag. She looked at Jason Miller, and for just 1 second, one single second, she let him see her eyes. Not the eyes of a janitor, the other eyes, the ones she kept locked away. And Jason Miller, who had never in his life been afraid of anything, felt something cold move down the center of his back, felt his grin falter without knowing why. Felt like a small animal that has just realized too late that the still shape in the tall grass was never a rock. Then Emily picked up her rag, and the moment was gone, and she was just a janitor again. You should check your fuel readings before you go up, she said quietly. The number 3 bird's been showing a slow leak on the left feed. Your crew chief hasn't caught it yet. And she pushed her cart out of the ready room and left them all sitting there in silence. The heck was that? Ryan Cole finally said. Jason Miller laughed, but it came out thin. Crazy old cleaning lady. What does she know about fuel feeds? But an hour later, when the crew chief pulled the panel on the number 3 aircraft to run a routine check, he found a slow leak on the left feed line. Small. The kind of thing that wouldn't have shown up on the gauges until the aircraft was already airborne and already committed. The kind of thing that could have turned a training flight into a funeral. The crew chief, a hard-bitten sergeant named Ellis, who had been fixing airplanes for 22 years, stood there looking at the leak with a strange feeling crawling up his neck. Because there was no way to see that from the outside. There was no way to know it without instruments, or without 20 years of your own turning wrenches, or without something else, something he couldn't name. Who told you to check this bird? Ellis asked the young airman beside him. Nobody, Sergeant. Cole said the cleaning lady told him to. Ellis looked up. The cleaning lady, he repeated. Yes, Sergeant. Ellis wiped his hands on a rag and stared down the length of the hangar toward the far corner where the light was dim, where a woman in a gray uniform was quietly stacking chairs, and for the first time in 4 years he actually looked at her. Really looked, and he thought to himself, now who in the world are you? Major Daniel Brooks had been the head of security at Raven Peak for 3 years, and he prided himself on knowing everything that happened on his base. He knew which airmen were sneaking off base after curfew. He knew which contractors padded their invoices. He knew the name of every dog that lived in base housing. Daniel Brooks was a noticing kind of man, and he had, over the last several months, begun to notice Emily Carter. It had started small. He had been watching a live fire exercise from the observation deck, and he had glanced down and seen the janitor standing off to the side, and he had noticed that she was standing in exactly the right place. Not the place a civilian would stand. Not the place that felt safe. The place that was safe. The place accounting for ricochet angles and blast geometry that no untrained person would ever think of. She had positioned herself without seeming to think about it at all in the one spot on that entire range where nothing could reach her. He had filed it away. Then there was the day one of the tower's backup radios had gone down, and the technicians had spent 2 hours failing to fix it, and Brooks had walked in to find the janitor emptying the trash, and he could have sworn, though he couldn't prove it, that she had glanced at the exposed circuitry, and her lips had moved slightly, like she was reading it, like she was diagnosing it before she caught him watching and looked away. He had filed that away too. And then there was the way she watched the aircraft. Everyone on a base watches the aircraft. Sometimes it's human, the machines are beautiful and terrible, and it's hard not to look. But most people watch them the way you watch fireworks. Emily watched them the way an old sailor watches the sea. There was longing in it, and respect, and something that looked almost like grief. Daniel Brooks was a noticing man, and he had noticed all of this, and one gray Tuesday morning, he decided he had noticed enough. He found her in the East Corridor, refilling the paper towel dispensers. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you have a minute." Emily didn't turn around right away. When she did, her face was pleasant and empty, the face of a woman who cleans floors and wants no trouble. "Something wrong, Major?" No, nothing's wrong." He put his hands behind his back. He was a big man, and he had learned to make himself smaller when he wanted people to talk to him. "I just wanted to ask you something. Been meaning to for a while." "All right. How long you been on this base?" 4 years, sir. Little over." "And before that?" Something flickered behind Emily's eyes and was gone. "Different work, nothing interesting." "See, that's the thing." Brooks smiled a little. "I've got a feeling it was interesting. I've got a feeling it was very interesting." He watched her carefully as he spoke the way you watch a card player's hands. "You stood in the safe spot at the range last month." "The real safe spot. Took me 9 years in the Army to learn to stand there. Where'd you learn it?" Emily's expression didn't change. "I read a lot, Major." "You read a lot. There's not much to do at night." Brooks nodded slowly like he was accepting it, and then he said very gently, "Sergeant Ellis says you found a fuel leak on the number 3 bird yesterday, from across a hangar, without instruments." For the first time, Emily went still, truly still. The kind of stillness that isn't the absence of movement, but the suppression of it, the stillness of a woman holding something with both hands. "I heard a hiss," she said. "Anybody could have heard it." Nobody else heard it. Then nobody else was listening. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and he knew he had walked up to the edge of something, and he knew that if he pushed 1 inch further, she would close up completely, and he would never get another chance. So he stepped back. "All right, Ms. Carter," he said. "You have a good day." "You too, Major." He walked away. But at the end of the corridor, he stopped and turned around, and Emily was already back to filling the dispensers, back to being invisible. And Daniel Brooks stood there and made himself a quiet promise. He was going to find out who Emily Carter was. Not to hurt her, not to expose her, just because he was a noticing man, and there was a mystery standing in his hallway wearing a gray uniform, and he had never in his life been able to leave a mystery alone. He didn't know that he wouldn't have to wait long. He didn't know that in a matter of days, the whole base would find out at once. The night before, it all came apart. Emily Carter sat alone in her small apartment, off base, and did what she did every night, which was to try very hard not to remember. It didn't work, of course. It never worked. She sat by the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and she looked out at the dark shape of the mountains, and the memories came anyway, the way they always came, uninvited and unstoppable. She remembered the squadron. She remembered their faces. She could still name every one of them, could still hear their voices on the radio, could still see the way the young ones grinned before a mission, because they didn't yet understand what missions could take from you. She remembered a man named Torres who used to sing off-key over the open channel until she made him stop, and a woman named Chen who could land a crippled aircraft in weather that would have killed anyone else, and a kid named Bishop, just a kid 23 years old who had called her ma'am, even though she was only a few years older, because that was how much they had all trusted her. Phantom Squadron. That was what they had called themselves, and she had led them. She remembered the last mission, the way you remember a wound in flashes and pieces, in the parts your mind will let you touch. She remembered giving the order. She remembered the sky going wrong. She remembered voices calling her name one after another, calling for Shadow, calling for their commander. And she remembered doing everything a human being could do, and it not being enough. She remembered coming home alone. She remembered the empty chairs. She remembered the sound the bass made afterward, which was the worst sound she had ever heard, which was the sound of nothing of a squadron that used to be loud and was now silent forever. They had given her medals for it. They had called her a hero. They had told her she had saved hundreds of lives on the ground, that the mission was a success, that she should be proud. And Emily Carter had taken off her flight suit and never put it on again. She had made a promise sitting in a dark apartment, much like this one 4 years and a lifetime ago. She had promised the ghosts of Phantom Squadron that she would never fly again, that she would not put another young pilot's life in her hands, that she would find a small, quiet corner of the world and disappear into it and do work that could not get anyone killed. Cleaning floors, emptying trash, work with no weight to it, no stakes, no lives hanging from her decisions like ornaments from a tree. She had kept that promise for 4 years. She set down her cold tea and pressed her fingers against her eyes, and she whispered to no one, to all of them, "I'm sorry, I'm still sorry. I'll always be sorry." And outside over the northwest ridge, the cloud deck kept stacking up higher and darker, exactly the way she had told Sarah Mitchell it would. The morning of the disaster began like any other. Emily arrived at 5. She parked in the far corner. She clocked in. She pushed her cart down the dark corridors and let the peace of the empty base settle over her, and for a little while she was all right. For a little while she was nobody, and being nobody was the only mercy she allowed herself. The training operation kicked off at 9. It was a big one, a full-wing exercise, dozens of aircraft coordinating strike packages and intercepts across a huge block of airspace. Jason Miller was up there. Ryan Cole was up there. Half the young pilots on the base were up there chasing each other across the Colorado sky, and every one of them was certain in the way only the young and the untested can be certain that they were invincible. Emily was cleaning the corridor outside the control center when it started to go wrong. She heard it before anyone said it. She heard the change in the sound of the room through the propped open door, the way the easy chatter of a routine exercise sharpened suddenly into something clipped and urgent. She heard a technician say a word she recognized, and then another word, and then the specific pitch of a voice trying not to sound afraid, and she stopped pushing her cart. Inside the control center, the radar had begun to fail. It didn't happen all at once. That was the terrible thing about it. If it had failed all at once, they would have known immediately what they were dealing with. Instead, it failed the way a rope frays one strand at a time, tracks flickering and dropping and reappearing in the wrong places. The whole picture of the sky slowly turning to lies. The controllers fought it. They rebooted. They switched to backups. And the backups showed them the same disintegrating picture aircraft blinking out and blinking back, dozens of pilots turning invisible one by one. "I've lost tracking on the second flight." Switch to backup array. Backup array is showing the same thing. It's not the display, it's the feed. Then fix the feed. "I'm trying to fix the feed." And through the door in the corridor, a janitor stood very still, with her hands on a cleaning cart, and listened to a nightmare unfold that she recognized, that she understood, that she knew in her bones exactly how to stop. She told herself to keep pushing the cart. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She told herself she had made a promise. She told herself that the moment she walked through that door, she would stop being nobody, and she had worked so hard for so long to be nobody, and there was no coming back from it once it was gone. And then a voice came through the open door. A controller reading off numbers in a voice that had started to shake. And Emily understood the numbers, and the numbers meant that somewhere up there in the gray, a flight of young pilots had just lost their guidance, and their fuel was burning down. And the weather she had warned about was closing in over the approach, and they were about to become exactly what her own squadron had become 4 years ago in a different sky. They were about to become empty chairs. And Emily Carter, who had promised the dead that she would never again hold a living pilot's life in her hands, closed her eyes and made her choice. She let go of the cart. She walked to the door of the control center. She stepped over the threshold into the restricted room, into the flashing red light and the shouting and the disintegrating sky on every screen. And for 1 second, nobody even noticed her, because who notices the janitor? Then a technician turned and saw a woman in a gray maintenance uniform standing in the middle of the most secure room on the base, and he shouted, "Hey, you can't be in here! Get her out of here!" And heads turned, and someone reached for a phone to call security, and the whole room rounded on her with the fury of frightened people looking for something to control. And Emily Carter, standing in the doorway with the weight of 4 years and 11 dead friends on her shoulders, looked past all of them at the main radar feed and read it in a single glance the way she had once read the sky. And she said in a voice that was not the voice of a janitor at all, a voice that cut clean through the panic and stopped the whole room cold. "It's not the feed, it's the phase alignment on the primary array. You've got a timing fault cascading into the backups because they're slave to the same clock. Break the slave run the backup on its own timing, and you'll have a picture in 90 seconds. The room went completely silent. Every person in that control center stopped and stared at the janitor who had just spoken about their classified radar system with more precision than any of them could have managed on their best day. The controller who had been reaching for the phone froze with his hand halfway to it. The senior officer on duty, a lieutenant colonel named Reyes, turned slowly and looked at this woman in the gray uniform as if he had never seen anything like her in his life, because he hadn't. He started. "Who the hell are you?" But Emily wasn't looking at him. She had already crossed the room. She was already standing over the primary console, her fingers hovering over the controls she had no clearance to touch, and she looked up at the terrified young technician sitting there. And she said gently, "Now, the way you speak to someone you're about to ask to trust you. There are pilots up there running out of time. I can bring them back on the scope. But you have to let me. Right now. You have to decide right now." And the technician looked into the eyes of the janitor, and he did not see a janitor. He saw something he had only ever seen in his instructors, in the veterans, in the handful of people he had met in his life, who had actually been where the numbers stop being numbers and start being people. He saw calm, total, bottomless, impossible calm, the kind that only comes to a person on the far side of the worst thing that will ever happen to them. He got up out of the chair. "Do it," he said. Emily sat down. Her hands moved. And every person in that room watched a woman they had walked past 1,000 times, a woman they had never once seen reach into the heart of a failing military system and begin with the sure and steady confidence of someone who had done impossible things before breakfast for a living to pull it back from the edge. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes stepped up behind her. He didn't try to stop her anymore. Some instinct older than protocol told him that stopping this woman would be the last mistake he ever made. Instead, he watched her hands, and he watched the screens, and he said very quietly in a voice that had gone strange with something between fear and hope, "You've done this before." Emily didn't look up from the console. "A long time ago," she said. "Where?" And Emily Carter, 4 years into, a silence she had sworn she would carry to her grave, felt the whole weight of her old life rising up in her chest, felt the ghost of who she used to be, settling back over her shoulders like a flight suit. She thought she'd burned, and she watched the first clean track appear on the radar screen. One aircraft, then another, the lost pilots coming home out of the static one by one, and she answered him. "Somewhere they told everyone I died." The tracks kept coming back. One by one, the young pilots reappeared on the scope, and the controllers scrambled to re-establish contact, and up in the gray Colorado sky, dozens of frightened kids in $40 million machines heard their radios crackle back to life, and heard the tower's voice return, and did not know, would never know, that the reason they were about to make it home was a woman in a janitor's uniform, sitting in a chair she had no right to sit in, doing a thing that only a handful of people alive could do. But Emily wasn't finished, because as the picture cleared, as the sky resolved out of the static and became readable again, she saw something at the edge of the scope, something the failing radar had been hiding inside all its lies. Something coming in low and fast from the northwest under the weather, in the exact blind spot the timing fault had opened up. She leaned toward the screen, her calm for the first time cracked. "Colonel," she said quietly. "What's that?" Reyes leaned in beside her. He saw it, and the blood drained out of his face. "That's not ours," he whispered. "No," Emily said. "It's not." And somewhere in the building a new alarm began to sound. A different alarm, the one they practiced for and never truly believed they would hear. And in the control center, every screen that Emily had just brought back to life now showed the same impossible, unthinkable thing filling the sky at the edge of American airspace. Emily Carter stood up out of the chair. The gray uniform hung on her exactly as it had a moment before. But the woman inside it was no longer the janitor. Everyone in that room could feel it. Something had come back into her, something they had no name for, and Lieutenant Colonel Reyes found himself without deciding to standing up straighter the way a man stands when a superior officer enters the room. Major Daniel Brooks burst through the door with two security officers behind him, and he stopped dead when he saw her standing at the center of it all, and every question he had been carrying for months arranged itself into a single certainty in his mind. "It's you," he said. "It was always you." Emily looked at him. Then she looked at the screens, at the hostile formation growing larger by the second, at the sky she had promised the dead she would never enter again. And she heard very clearly in the quiet room at the center of herself the voices of Phantom Squadron. Torres singing off-key, Chin bringing the crippled bird home, Bishop calling her ma'am, all of them gone, all of them lost in a sky she couldn't save them from. But these pilots weren't lost yet. These pilots were still up there, still alive, still calling for guidance in voices that shook. And there was only one person on Raven Peak Air Force Base who could give it to them. Emily Carter turned toward the door that led to the flight line, and she spoke, and her voice was steady, and it filled the room, and not one person in it, not the colonel, not the major, not the technicians who had tried to throw her out 3 minutes before ever forgot the sound of it. "I need a flight suit," she said, "and I need it now. I need a flight suit, and I need it now." The words hung in the control center like smoke. Nobody moved. And then because nobody moved, Emily Carter said them again, and this time there was steel underneath. "Colonel Reyes, those pilots up there have maybe 8 minutes of usable fuel in a hostile formation between them and the runway. Every second you spend staring at me is a second one of them dies. So I'll ask you one time, are you going to help me or are you going to watch?" Lieutenant Colonel Reyes was 51 years old. He had flown 200 combat missions in his life. He had given orders to generals and taken orders from presidents. And in that moment, standing in front of a woman in a janitor's uniform, with dirty water still drying on the collar, he felt something he had not felt since he was a lieutenant, felt small, felt like a boy in the presence of something larger than himself. "Get her a suit," he said. "Sir," a young officer stammered, "she's a civilian. She doesn't have clearance to be in this room, let alone—" "I said get her a suit," Reyes roared, and the young officer flinched and ran. Major Daniel Brooks stepped forward. He had spent months chasing the mystery of Emily Carter, down quiet corridors, filing away one strange observation after another, promising himself he would find out who she was. And now the answer was standing in front of him, plain as daylight, and it frightened him more than he expected. "You're going to fly," he said. It wasn't a question. "You're a janitor, and you're going to climb into a fighter jet and fly." Emily turned to look at him, and for just a second the mask slipped, and Brooks saw something in her face that made his throat go tight. Grief, an ocean of it. The face of a woman being asked to walk back into the room where everyone she loved had died. "I was never a janitor, Major," she said quietly. "I just needed to be one for a while." Then she was moving, and the room moved with her. 12 minutes earlier, none of them had known her name. Now they parted in front of her like water in front of the bow of a ship. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen against the far wall, her folders clutched to her chest, watching. She had said good morning to this woman 100 times. She had brought her coffee once on a cold day, and Emily had looked so surprised, so unused to kindness, that Sarah had never forgotten it. And now Sarah understood all at once every strange thing she had ever noticed. The wind shear, the engine sounds, the way Emily's eyes tracked aircraft across the sky, like she was flying them herself from the ground. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "It was you. All this time it was you, and we made you clean our floors." Emily heard it. She didn't stop walking. But something in her face softened just barely, and as she passed Sarah, she said so quietly that only Sarah heard it, "You were kind to me. I won't forget it." And then she was gone through the door, and Sarah Mitchell burst into tears without fully knowing why. 9 minutes on the clock now. The alarm was still screaming, and up on the flight line, chaos. The word had spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. The janitor was going to fly. Crew chiefs stopped in their tracks. Airmen came running out of the maintenance bays. And there in the middle of it all stood Jason Miller, breathed still in his own flight suit, having just landed from the exercise minutes before the whole world turned upside down. He saw Emily coming across the tarmac in a borrowed flight suit that fit her like it had been made for her, moving with a purpose that made the crowd fall silent, and something in Jason Miller broke loose. "No," he said. "No, no, no, no. This is a joke. Somebody tell me this is a joke." He stepped into her path. You can't even hold a mop straight, and they're putting you in my aircraft." Emily stopped in front of him. For 4 years, she had absorbed everything this young man had thrown at her. The insults, the laughter, the shove into the toolbox not 20 minutes ago that had left a bruise blooming on her shoulder right now, under the flight suit where no one could see it. She had taken all of it in silence because silence was the price of being nobody, and being nobody was the only way she knew how to survive. But she was not nobody anymore. "Captain," she said, and her voice was calm and terrible, "you have 400 flight hours, every one of them in perfect weather in a training area with a wingman and a tanker and a whole country between you and anyone who wants you dead. I have flown missions that don't have names. I have flown missions they burned the records of. I have brought aircraft home that should have fallen out of the sky, and I have watched aircraft fall out of the sky that I couldn't save, and I have carried the weight of every single one of them for 4 years while you laughed at me across a hangar." She stepped closer, and Jason Miller, who was not afraid of anything, took a step back. "So get out of my way, before those enemy pilots do to these kids what I've already lived through once, because I am not going to bury another squadron, not while I can still fly." Jason Miller's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And Sergeant Ellis, the crew chief, the man who had found the fuel leak she called from across a hangar, stepped up beside Emily and looked at Jason and said the thing that ended it. "Move, Captain. The lady's got work to do." Jason Miller moved. 7 minutes. Emily climbed the ladder to the cockpit of the F-35, and the movement was so smooth, so practiced, so utterly certain that the crowd on the tarmac made a sound, a collective intake of breath, because there was no faking that. You could fake a lot of things. You could not fake the way a body knows a machine it has loved. Ellis followed her up, running through the systems with her, and he kept expecting to have to explain things, kept opening his mouth to help, and every single time she was already ahead of him, already reaching for the switch he was about to name, already reading the display before he could point to it. "Ma'am," Ellis said, finally, his voice cracking, "I've been doing this 22 years. "Who are you?" Emily strapped in. She pulled her helmet down, and through the visor she looked at the old sergeant with eyes that had seen the far side of the sky, and she said, "Phantom Shadow, now clear my ladder, Sergeant. I've got somewhere to be." Ellis went down the ladder like his legs had forgotten how to hold him. Inside the control center, Reyes and Brooks stood over the radar watching the hostile formation grow. 6 aircraft, advanced, coordinated, coming in under the weather exactly the way Emily said they would, exploiting the blind spot the radar fault had opened, and if she hadn't been standing in that corridor at that exact moment, if she hadn't broken every rule and walked through that door, no one would have seen them coming until they were already overhead. 6 of them, Brooks said, 6 advanced fighters, and we're sending up 1 woman and 1 jet who hasn't flown in 4 years. "She's not one woman," Reyes said quietly, and Brooks turned to look at him. Reyes was staring at the screen at the call sign the tower had just assigned it, 3 words that had made every hair on his arm stand up when he saw them. "What is it?" Brooks said. "What's wrong?" Reyes pointed at the screen with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "That call sign," he said, "Phantom Shadow. I know that call sign, Daniel. Every pilot my age knows that call sign." He swallowed. 4 years ago, there was a mission, classified so deep most people don't even know it happened. A whole squadron went in to cover a ground extraction that was about to get overrun. 200, 300 people on the ground surrounded out of time. The squadron went in against numbers no one should have flown against. He stopped. His jaw worked. They lost everyone, every pilot but one. And the one who made it out, the one who held the whole thing together long enough for those people on the ground to get clear, the one they gave a medal to and then watched disappear off the face of the earth because she couldn't stand to wear it. "No," Brooks said. Her call sign, Reyes said, was Phantom Shadow. The 2 men stared at each other, and then together they turned and looked out the window toward the flight line where a single F-35 was taxiing toward the runway with a calm and awful grace, and neither of them said anything at all because there was nothing left to say. The woman they had let clean their floors for 4 years had once flown into hell to save 300 strangers and come out the only survivor. and she was about to do it again. 6 minutes. Up in the gray, the young pilots were coming apart. There were 4 of them still airborne from the exercise, 4 kids in F-35s who had lost their radar picture, lost their tanker, and now had a hostile formation between them and home. Their flight lead was a 27-year-old captain named Amanda Reyes, the colonel's own daughter, and she was doing everything right, and it wasn't enough. Her voice on the radio had climbed half an octave. Her fuel was a problem, and the enemy was closing. Tower, this is Viper flight. We need vectors. We need vectors. Now I've got 4 aircraft low on fuel, and I've got contacts I cannot identify, and I need help. A pause, then smaller, younger, more human. Somebody please tell me what to do. And a voice came onto the radio. It was calm. It was warm. It was the steadiest voice any of those kids had ever heard, a voice with no fear in it at all. A voice that seemed to reach up out of the chaos and take each of them by the hand. Viper flight, this is Phantom Shadow. I'm coming up to you now. I want you to listen to my voice and nothing else. You're going to be all right. Every one of you is going home tonight. But I need you to do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. Can you do that for me? Viper flight. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, Amanda Reyes felt something loosen in her chest, felt the panic recede half a step, felt absurdly safe for the first time in 10 minutes. Who is that? She breathed. Who is that voice? In the control center, her father heard his daughter's voice come through the speaker, heard the fear in it, and gripped the edge of the console until his knuckles went white. And then he heard the other voice answer her, that impossible calm, and he watched on the radar as a single friendly track lifted off the runway and began to climb toward his child at a rate that made the technicians gasp. Come on, Reyes whispered. Come on, Shadow. Get to her. Get to my girl. 5 minutes. Emily Carter climbed into the sky, and the sky took her back like it had never let her go. She had told herself for 4 years that she had forgotten, that the promise she made to the dead had erased everything, sanded her down to nothing but a woman with a mop. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie the second the wheels left the runway, the second the horizon dropped away beneath her, and the whole enormous world opened up on every side. Her hands didn't need her. They moved on their own, sure and quick and certain, and the machine answered them like an animal that had been waiting its whole life for the right rider. She was crying. She noticed it distantly the way you notice weather. Tears running down inside her helmet, blurring the edges of the display. 4 years of grief and silence and self-imposed exile pouring out of her all at once because she was home. God help her, she was home in the one place she had sworn she would never return to, and it felt like her own heart beating for the first time since the day her squadron died. Torres, she said aloud to no one, to all of them. Chen, Bishop, all of you, I'm sorry I stopped. I'm sorry I ran. She leveled off and pointed the nose at the 4 struggling tracks on her display and the 6 hostile tracks beyond them. But I hear these kids calling, and I can't leave them up here alone. You understand? You of all people understand. And in the silence of the cockpit, in the roar of the engine, she could have sworn she heard them answer. Go get them, Shadow. Go bring them home. 4 minutes. Viper flight, Phantom Shadow, I have you visual. I'm on your left side high. Do you see me? Amanda Reyes looked left and up, and there, sliding into the sky beside her with a smoothness that didn't seem possible, was another F-35, and something about the way it flew, the absolute economy of it, the way it seemed to belong to the air, more than to the machine, made her let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like her whole life. I see you, Phantom Shadow. God, am I glad to see you. Good girl. Now here's what's going to happen. The bandits haven't committed yet. They're testing us. They came in expecting to find us blind and scattered, and for a few minutes there, they were right. Emily's voice never changed pitch, never sped up, stayed that same warm, steady rhythm that made it impossible to panic while she was talking. But we're not blind anymore, and we're not scattered. I want you to take your flight and turn for home right now on the heading towers about to give you. Get on the deck, get under the weather, and get on the ground. Ma'am, we can't just leave you up here alone against 6. Amanda. The voice came softer now and used her name, and Amanda Reyes felt her eyes sting. I have done this before, this exact thing, and I have spent 4 years wishing I had done it differently. Let me do it right this time. Take your people home. There was a silence on the radio, a long one. How do you know my name? Amanda finally said. And Emily Carter, 40,000 feet over Colorado, looked out at the 6 hostile fighters turning to face her and thought about a colonel standing in a control center watching his daughter on a radar screen. And she smiled inside her helmet, a sad and tender smile. "Because your father is downstairs losing his mind," she said. "And I promised him you'd come home. Now don't make a liar out of me, Captain. Go." Amanda Reyes broke for home. Her 3 wingmen followed. 4 F-35s dove for the deck and the weather and the runway, and behind them alone, a single fighter turned to face 6, 3 minutes. In the control center, Colonel Reyes watched his daughter's track break away from danger and turn toward home, and he put his hand over his mouth, and Daniel Brooks looked away to give the man his privacy, because there are some things a man should not have to be seen feeling. "She's turning them home," Brooks said. "Colonel, your daughter's coming home." Reyes couldn't answer. "But that leaves her," Brooks said, quieter now, and they both looked at the single friendly track on the screen alone, now turning into the 6 hostiles. "1 against 6. Colonel, we have to send backup. We have to scramble something. We have to—" "There's nothing to scramble in time," Reyes said hoarsely. "You know that. The alert birds are down for the exercise. Anything else is 20 minutes out." He stared at the screen. She knew that. She knew it when she got in the jet. She's not up there to hold them off until help comes, Daniel. There is no help. She's up there because she's the only help there is. The words landed in the room like a physical weight. Every technician, every officer, every airman crowded into that control center understood in the same instant what they were watching. Not a rescue, not a delaying action. One woman, 4 years out of the cockpit, flying alone against impossible odds, because there was no one else, and she had known it, and she had gone anyway. The way she had gone once before, 2 minutes. Down on the flight line, Jason Miller stood at the edge of the tarmac and stared up at the sky. He couldn't see into, at the drama playing out 40,000 feet above him, and something was happening to him that had never happened to Jason Miller in his entire charmed and easy life. He was ashamed. Sergeant Ellis stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the same empty sky. "You know what she said to me on that ladder," Ellis said, not looking at Jason. "She thanked me for clearing her ladder. 22 years I've been doing this, and the greatest pilot I ever put in a cockpit thanked me for doing my job while she flew off to die for a bunch of kids who spit on her." He turned his head and looked at Jason Miller, and there was no cruelty in his face, just a terrible, quiet disappointment. "You shoved her into a toolbox this morning, Captain. I saw it. Whole hangar saw it. And she's up there right now, maybe about to give her life, so yours means something." He looked back at the sconch. "You're going to carry that. For the rest of your days, you're going to carry that. I hope it makes you better. Because right now, it ought to make you sick." Jason Miller said nothing, but his eyes were wet and his hands were shaking. And for the first time in his life, he prayed awkwardly, silently, for someone other than himself. "Please," he thought, "please let her live. Please let me tell her I'm sorry. 1 minute." Sarah Mitchell had made her way onto the flight line without anyone stopping her, and she stood with the growing crowd of airmen and pilots and crew chiefs, everyone looking up. Everyone silent, the whole base holding its breath as one. And she thought about a cold morning 4 months ago, when she had brought a cup of coffee to a janitor she barely knew on an impulse because it was freezing, and the woman looked tired. She remembered how Emily had looked at the coffee and then at Sarah with an expression Sarah hadn't understood at the time, an expression like she'd forgotten people did things like that, like kindness was a language she used to speak and had gone years without hearing. Now Sarah understood. Now she understood everything. "Come home," Sarah whispered at the sky. "Please come home. You've given enough. You've given so much more than enough." 40,000 feet above her, Emily Carter armed her systems and steadied her breathing and looked at the 6 hostile fighters filling her display. 6 advanced machines flown by pilots who wanted her dead. 6 against 1, and she felt the old, cold calm settle over her. The calm that had kept her alive through missions that killed everyone else. The calm that had a name in the classified files no one was allowed to read. She keyed the radio one last time. Not to the tower, to the enemy. On the open channel so they'd hear her coming in, a voice as level as a frozen lake. "Unknown aircraft, this is Phantom Shadow of the United States Air Force. You've entered our airspace. You came here thinking we were blind. You came here thinking we were weak. You came here thinking there was no one left to stop you. A pause, and then softer and somehow far more frightening for it. You thought wrong. Turn around now. This is the only warning you get. The 6 hostile fighters did not turn around. They accelerated toward her. And in the control center, Colonel Reyes watched his radar screen show 1 friendly track and 6 enemy tracks converging at a combined speed that made the numbers meaningless, and he heard the enemy fail to answer the warning, and he closed his eyes. God be with you, Shadow, he said. Emily Carter took a breath. 4 years of silence. 4 years of a mop in a gray uniform and a promise made to the dead. 4 years of being nobody, of hiding, of running from the one thing she was born to do. It ended here, now in the sky. She pushed the throttle forward, and the F-35 leapt toward the enemy like it had been waiting 4 years to be let off the leash, and the last thing anyone on the ground heard before the fight began was the janitor. Nobody had noticed the ghost pilot. They had all forgotten, speaking 3 quiet words into her mask that no microphone was ever meant to catch. For my squadron, the first pass happened faster than the human mind was built to follow. 6 enemy fighters came at Emily Carter in a spread formation, the textbook opening the move that was supposed to overwhelm a single defender by giving her too many threats to track at once. It was a good tactic. It was the tactic she would have expected. And it told her in the first half second of contact exactly what kind of pilots she was dealing with. They were good, they were disciplined, they were trained, and they had never once flown against someone like her. Emily didn't try to meet all 6. That was the trap, and only a young pilot fell into it, the instinct to face every threat at once and end up facing none of them properly. Instead, she picked the one on the far right, the outside edge of the formation, the seam, and she went for it with a violence and precision that turned 4 years of rust to dust in an instant. She rolled hard pulled, and the world compressed into a gray tunnel as the G-forces slammed her down into her seat, and she welcomed it. Welcomed the crushing weight because it meant she was alive, and she was flying, and she was doing the thing her hands had never forgotten how to do. In the control center, the technicians watched the friendly track do something the software almost couldn't render, a turn so tight the display stuttered, trying to draw it. That's not possible, someone breathed. You can't turn an F-35 like that. The airframe won't. She's not flying the airframe, Colonel Reyes said, and his voice was strange reverent. She's flying the edge of it. She's living in the last 2% nobody's brave enough to touch. The outside enemy fighter tried to follow her turn. It couldn't. Its pilot was good, but good has limits, and Emily had gone somewhere past the limits, into a place only a handful of people who had ever lived could reach. She came out of the turn behind him, exactly where she wanted to be, and for one long, silent moment, she had him dead to rights, a shot she could not miss. She didn't take it. Instead, her voice came onto the open channel again, calm level, almost gentle. That's 1, she said. I'm behind your number 6 and I haven't fired. That's not mercy, that's a message. I want the rest of you to understand exactly what's about to happen to you if you don't turn around right now. I've been where you are. On the wrong side of a fight, I couldn't win. I'm giving you the chance nobody gave the people I loved. Turn around. The enemy formation wavered. She could see it on her display, the tracks hesitating, the coordination stuttering, doubt rippling through 6 cockpits at once. She had rattled them. A single defender outnumbered 6-1 had just slipped behind their formation in the opening seconds and then declined to kill, and there is nothing in the world more frightening to a fighter pilot than an enemy who is so certain of victory that they can afford to let you live. But the doubt didn't hold. A voice came back on the channel, accented hard. You are 1 aircraft. We are 6. You cannot save them all. I don't have to save them all, well, Emily said. They're already gone. I sent them home while you were still finding your courage. There's no one up here but me and you now. And then softer, colder, the temperature of deep space. So the only question left is how many of you want to go home tonight? Down in the control center, Daniel Brooks realized he had stopped breathing. She sent the kids home first, he said slowly, the full weight of it landing on him. Before she engaged, she got Amanda and the others out of the fight, and then she turned to face 6 enemies alone on purpose, so there'd be nothing for them to shoot at but her. He looked at Reyes. Colonel, she made herself the only target. She's up there right now being the only thing worth shooting at so those kids can land safe. Reyes couldn't speak. On another screen, he could see his daughter's flight, 4 friendly tracks dropping through the weather toward the runway, safe home alive because a woman they'd all ignored had put her own body between them and the enemy guns. "Get me a line to the alert wing at the next base," Reyes finally managed. "I don't care that they're 20 minutes out. I want everything that can fly flying." She bought us time. I am not going to waste it. The second pass was not like the first. The enemy had learned. They came at her more carefully now in coordinated pairs, trying to box her in one pair to fix her in place while another pair swung around behind. It was smart. It was the right answer to what she'd shown them, and it would have worked on almost any pilot alive. But Emily Carter had not survived the mission that killed her entire squadron by being almost any pilot. She had survived it by seeing 3 moves ahead when everyone around her was struggling to see one, by understanding a fight not as a series of maneuvers, but as a single flowing thing, a conversation, a dance where she was always speaking the sentence after next while her opponents were still stammering out the words in front of them. She saw the box forming before it formed, and instead of running from it, she flew into it, straight into the closing jaws of the trap, and every controller watching the radar cried out at once, because it looked like suicide. It looked like she'd lost her mind. It looked like she was flying directly into the kill. And then at the last possible instant, at the exact moment the trap should have snapped shut, she wasn't there. She had gone vertical straight up, standing the fighter on its tail, and rocketing into the sky, and the 2 enemy pairs that had been converging to crush her instead nearly collided with each other where she had been a half-second before. The coordination shattered. For one crucial moment, all 6 enemy fighters were reacting instead of acting, scrambling to avoid each other. Their beautiful trap collapsed into chaos, and Emily Carter hung above all of it at the top of her climb, upside down, looking down at the confusion she had created, master of the whole sky. "That's 2, she said quietly. "You just flew into each other trying to catch me. You're getting frustrated. Frustrated pilots make mistakes. And up here, mistakes are the only thing that kills you." In the ready room back on base, a crowd had gathered around the speakers, listening to the open channel, and among them stood Jason Miller, and every word Emily spoke went into him like a nail. She was up there alone, outnumbered 4 years out of the cockpit, and she was not just surviving, she was toying with them. She was teaching them. She was schooling 6 enemy aces in the thing he had bragged about being the best at not 12 hours before. "My scores are the best in the class," he had said. "Second best isn't even close." He wanted to sink through the floor. He wanted to disappear. He thought about the shove, the toolbox, the dirty water on her face, the years of laughter, and he understood with a clarity that felt like being turned inside out, that he had spent his whole career mistaking confidence for skill and volume for courage, and that the quietest person on the entire base, the one he'd been cruelest to, was the only real warrior any of them had ever stood next to. "Turn it up," Jason said hoarsely to the airman by the speaker. "Turn it up. I want to hear her. I want to hear everything she does." The third pass drew blood. Not hers. Theirs. One of the enemy pilots, exactly as Emily had predicted, got frustrated and got greedy and pressed an attack a half-second too long, trying to force a shot she'd already denied him twice. He overcommitted. He gave her his belly, and this time Emily Carter did not decline. There was a flash on the radar, and then there were 5 enemy tracks instead of 6. The control center erupted a raw animal roar of hope. Men and women who a moment before had been silent with dread, suddenly on their feet, shouting, gripping each other, because the impossible was happening in front of them. One alone was beating 6, and every one of them knew they were watching something that would never happen again in their lifetimes. "She got 1, Brooks shouted. "Colonel, she got 1, that's 5. She's down to 5. But Reyes wasn't celebrating. He was watching the way the remaining 5 enemy tracks moved, and his stomach turned to ice, because now they weren't frustrated anymore. Now they were afraid, and afraid was worse. "They're going to stop playing," Reyes said grimly. "They just lost a man to a single defender they thought they'd swat in seconds. They know now what they're dealing with, and they're going to throw everything they have at her at once, all 5, no more probing, no more testing. All 5 at once." He looked at the clock. "How long on that alert wing?" 14 minutes, sir." "She doesn't have 14 minutes, Reyes said quietly. "Not against 5 committed." Up in the sky, Emily Carter knew it too. She had felt the change the instant it happened, the enemy going from cocky to careful to committed. And she knew the next pass would be the real one. The one where they came at her with everything, all five, no restraint, no coordination games. Just five desperate pilots trying to overwhelm one woman by sheer weight of numbers before she thinned them out any further. She had one advantage left. They wanted to survive. She had made her peace with the sky 4 years ago. Or as she said softly to the ghost in the seat beside her, that only she could feel. Remember the thing you taught me, the last resort thing, the one you said only a crazy person would ever try? She almost laughed, and it came out as something closer to a sob. I think this is the crazy person situation you were talking about. She reconfigured her fighter for a fight no sane pilot would choose. She turned into the five of them alone, deliberately offering herself up as the target, because as long as they were all focused on her, they weren't hurting anyone else. And every second she stayed alive was another second closer to the alert wing that was 14 minutes out and might as well have been 14 years. And on the ground, the whole base listened as the open channel filled with the sound of the enemy formation, committing five voices, coordinating a killing blow, and then one voice cut through all of them, calm and warm, and utterly without fear, the voice of a woman who had already died once 4 years ago and had nothing left to be afraid of. All right, Emily Carter said. Come on then, all five of you. Let's see if you're as good as you think you are. Sarah Mitchell, standing on the flight line, gripped the arm of the airman next to her, hard enough to bruise. Jason Miller in the ready room gripped the edge of the table and prayed. Sergeant Ellis stared at the sky with his jaw clenched and tears cutting down his weathered face. Colonel Reyes watched his radar and thought of his daughter, safe on the ground now, because of the woman about to be swarmed, and Major Daniel Brooks, who had spent months trying to solve the mystery of Emily Carter, finally understood that the answer had never been in her records or her past. The answer was a bare 40,000 feet over Colorado, turning alone into five enemy fighters so that no one else had to. The five hostile tracks and the one friendly track rushed toward each other on the radar. And then at the moment of contact, at the instant, the whole base braced for the friendly track to vanish. Something happened that no one in that control center would ever be able to fully explain, something that would live in classified footage and whispered stories for the rest of all their lives. Something that made even Colonel Reyes, a man with 200 combat missions, lean forward with his mouth open like a child watching the impossible unfold. The single friendly track dove straight down into the weather, into the storm front. Emily had warned Sarah about that very morning, into the wind shear and the churning gray that no pilot in their right mind would fly into on purpose. And all five enemy fighters, committed at full speed, chasing the one thing they wanted to kill, followed her in. They followed her into the storm, and the storm was hers. Emily Carter had spent 4 years cleaning the floors of a base that sat higher in the sky than almost any other in the country. And every single morning of those 4 years, she had watched the weather come over the Northwest Ridge, and she had read it the way other people read the newspaper. She knew this front. She had felt it building the day before. She had told Sarah Mitchell it would lie to you, and now she flew into the belly of the lie on purpose because she understood something the five pilots chasing her did not. She wasn't running into the weather to escape them. She was running into it to kill them. Inside the storm, the radar picture that had guided the enemy formation dissolved into static and ghosts. The wind shear she'd predicted grabbed the aircraft and threw them invisible fists slamming up from below, and the five hostile pilots who had been so coordinated, so disciplined, so certain of their numbers, suddenly found themselves alone in a screaming gray, nothing where they couldn't see each other, couldn't see her, couldn't trust their own instruments, couldn't tell up from down. And into that chaos, calm as a Sunday morning, came Emily. "You feel that?" she said on the open channel, and her voice was the only steady thing in a world that had turned to violence. "That's the shear on the backside of the ridge. I've watched it every day for 4 years. I know exactly where it lives and exactly how it moves. You don't." A pause, and the storm howled around all of them. 6 of you came into my sky thinking numbers would win it. Now there's 5 of you, and you can't even find each other. Welcome to my home. In the control center, the radar showed almost nothing now. The whole engagement swallowed by the storm, cell 6 tracks reduced to intermittent flickers that appeared and vanished like fireflies. "We've lost the picture," a technician said, panic climbing back into his voice. "Colonel, we've lost them, all of them. We can't see what's happening in there." "She can see," Colonel Reyes said. He was standing very still, his hands flat on the console, his eyes fixed on the storm cell, as if he could see through it by force of will. That's the whole point. She took them into the one place where her 4 year of pushing a mop is worth more than their 6 advanced fighters. She turned her weakness into the battlefield. He shook his head slowly. My God. She's been planning this since the moment she heard the radar fail. She's been 3 moves ahead of everyone in this building the entire time. Daniel Brooks stared at the storm cell on the screen and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a kind of awe that bordered on fear. Who trains a person to think like that, he said quietly. Who has to become that to survive? Reyes didn't answer. He was thinking about the mission 4 years ago, the one whose records they'd burned. He was thinking about what it would take to be the only one to walk out of something like that. And he understood in a way he hadn't before that the calm in Emily Carter's voice was not the absence of fear. It was the presence of something worse. It was the calm of a person who had already lost everything they had and so could not be threatened with loss anymore. Inside the storm, the killing began. Emily worked the shear like an instrument. She knew where the updrafts lived and where the downdrafts waited, knew the seams and the pockets, knew how to use a wall of rising air to fling herself sideways in a way that looked to her pursuers like she'd simply teleported. One of the enemy pilots, disoriented, fighting his own aircraft, as much as her, drifted into a downdraft she'd been steering him toward for 30 seconds without him ever knowing it. And the shear took him low and slow at exactly the wrong moment, and he had to fight so hard to recover that he lost all situational awareness. And when he finally clawed his way back to level flight, Emily Carter was already there waiting exactly where she'd known he'd end up. Flash on the radar. 4 tracks now. That's 3, she said, and there was no triumph in it, only a terrible tiredness. I keep hoping one of you will turn around. I keep hoping I won't have to. I've had enough of this. I've had 4 years of enough of this. Turn around and go home. The control center didn't erupt this time. They had learned. They watched the flickering tracks in the storm, and they held their breath because 4-1 was still 4-1, and a storm that killed the enemy could kill her just as dead. 3 down, Brooks breathed. She's taken half of them, half Colonel alone in 4 minutes. And any one of the 4 left can still get her, Reyes said. It only takes 1. She knows that better than we do. He glanced at the clock on the wall and his jaw tightened. 11 minutes on the alert wing. Come on, Shadow. 11 minutes. Stay alive 11 more minutes. But 11 minutes is a very long time in a storm with 4 enemies hunting you. And Emily Carter was tiring. She felt it now, the fatigue that 4 years on the ground had left in muscles that used to do this every day. Her arms burned from wrestling the aircraft through the shear. Her vision narrowed and swam at the edges from the G-forces she kept pulling. She was 45 years old, 4 years out of the cockpit, and her body was writing checks that her will was cashing on credit. And she knew with the clear, cold honesty she'd always kept for herself in the worst moments that she could not keep this up forever. She had to end it. Fast, before her body gave out, before the enemy did. And so she did the thing that Torres had taught her, the last resort thing, the thing only a crazy person would try. She stopped running. In the middle of the storm, blind outnumbered 4-1, Emily Carter pulled her throttle back hard and let her aircraft slow to a speed that no fighter pilot in a dogfight ever willingly flew, a speed that in normal air would have been suicide, that stripped away her energy and her maneuverability and left her hanging in the sky like a target on a string. But this was not normal air. This was her storm, and she knew something. She knew that the 4 pilots hunting her were all going fast because that's what frightened pilots do. They keep their speed up. Speed feels like safety. And she knew that at the speed they were flying in this shear, with the picture gone and their nerves frayed, at least one of them would come screaming through the gray far faster than they could react, expecting her to be running the way she'd been running the whole fight. And they would fly right past her. The first one did. An enemy fighter came ripping out of the murk at nearly twice her speed, and its pilot saw her a half second too late, and there was nothing he could do. Nothing at all, because he was going too fast to turn and too committed to stop. And he flashed past her belly so close that the wash of his passage rocked her wings. And Emily Carter, hanging in the sky at a speed that should have killed her, was pointed at exactly nothing. Was the slowest and most controlled thing in the entire storm, and she rolled lazily onto the fleeing fighter's tail as it overshot her, and she took the shot. Flash. 3 tracks now. In the control center, Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She's not even running anymore, he whispered. She stopped. She stopped in the middle of a 4-to-1 fight and let them overshoot her. Nobody teaches that. Nobody would dare teach that. Where did she learn that? Down on the flight line, the crowd of airmen and pilots had gone completely silent, listening to the open channel. And every time there was a flash on the radar, somebody would relay it back through the ranks. 3 down, now 4, now 5. And each time the crowd would make a low sound of disbelief, and Sergeant Ellis stood among them with his hat off, holding it against his chest, the way a man holds his hat at a funeral or in a church because he wasn't sure anymore which one this was. Jason Miller had come out of the ready room. He couldn't stand to be inside anymore. He needed to be out under the open sky close to the fight, even if he couldn't see it. And he stood a little apart from the others with his arms wrapped around himself, and he listened to Emily Carter's voice come down out of the storm. And every steady, exhausted, merciful word of it was a hammer on the anvil of who he thought he was. She kept offering them the chance to leave. That was the thing he couldn't get past. 3 enemies dead, and she was still on that open channel telling the survivors to turn around, go home, live. A better pilot than he would ever be in the fight of her life, and she was trying to save the lives of the men trying to kill her. "I don't understand her," he said to no one, his voice cracking. "How do you do that? How do you be like that?" "You don't understand her," said a voice beside him, and he turned to find Sarah Mitchell standing there, her face wet, her eyes never leaving the sky. "Because you've never lost anything. That's what makes her like that. She's not fighting to win, Captain. She lost the thing that makes a person want to win 4 years ago. She's up there because she can't stand to watch it happen to anybody else. That's not skill. You can't train that. That's a broken heart that decided to keep other hearts from breaking." Jason Miller looked at her, and then he looked at the sky, and he had nothing to say because she was right, and he knew she was right, and it was the truest and most terrible thing anyone had ever said to him. 3 enemy fighters left, and 9 minutes to the alert wing. But now the storm began to work against Emily too. She had used it to blind them, to disorient them, to kill 3 of them. But the same balance that took her enemies apart was tearing at her aircraft and her body with every second she stayed inside it. A downdraft caught her wrong and slammed her toward the earth, and for 3 long seconds, she fought the controls with everything she had left, her vision going gray at the edges, the ground rushing up somewhere below the murk. And she pulled, and the aircraft groaned and shuddered, and finally answered, leveling out with less altitude beneath her than she wanted to think about. She was breathing hard now. She could hear it in her own mask. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion, from 4 years of rust and 45 years of life, and the simple physical impossibility of what she was asking her body to do. "Come on," she told herself. "Come on, old woman. A little longer, just a little longer." And in the storm, the 3 surviving enemy pilots, terrified, furious, humiliated by a single defender who had halved their number, finally did the smart thing, the thing she'd been dreading. They stopped chasing her individually. They found each other by radio, coordinated by voice, since their instruments were useless, and they came together and they started climbing out of the top of the storm to reset, to get above the weather where they could see again, where numbers would matter once more, where 3 could work as a team against 1 exhausted woman. Emily saw them go on her display, 3 tracks climbing for clear air, and she understood exactly what they were doing. And she understood that if they got above the weather and reorganized, she was probably going to die. She had 2 choices. She could stay in the storm safe for now and let them reset and face 3 fresh coordinated fighters in clear air where all her advantages were gone. Or she could follow them up out of her sanctuary into the open sky and try to break them before they could form up. It was no choice at all. It had never been a choice, not from the second she walked through that control center door. She followed them up. She climbed out of the storm on their tails, out of the screaming gray, and into the sudden shocking blue of the clear high sky above the weather. And there they were, 3 enemy fighters, just beginning to reorganize. Just beginning to turn toward each other, to form up, caught in the worst possible moment, wings level energy, low, not yet a team. And Emily Carter came up out of the storm behind them like a ghost rising out of a grave, and she was on them before they knew she'd followed. "That's the mistake," she said quietly. "You climbed to reset. You gave me your backs to do it. In 4 years of pushing a mop, I never forgot that the deadliest moment in any fight is the moment you think you've made it to safety." Flash. 2 tracks. The control center broke. Whatever restraint had been holding them shattered, and grown men and women who had spent 20 years in uniform were shouting, crying, pounding the consoles because they were watching the impossible complete itself in front of them. 1 against 6 was now 1 against 2, and the woman doing it was someone they'd walked past 1,000 times without ever seeing her face. 2! Brooks was shouting, gripping Reyes by the shoulders. Colonel, it's 2. She's got them down to 2. She's actually going to... Don't, Reyes said, and his voice stopped Brooks cold. Don't say it. Don't you dare say it. Because Reyes was a pilot, and pilots are the most superstitious people alive, and he had watched too many good pilots die in the last 2 minutes of a fight they'd already won. It's not over. 2 can still kill her. And look at her track, Daniel. Look at how she's flying now. Brooks looked, and he saw it. The friendly track wasn't as sharp anymore. The turns were a fraction slower. The precision that had carved through 6 enemies was fraying at the edges, and Brooks realized with a cold drop in his stomach what he was seeing. She was running out, not of fuel, of herself. Up in the clear sky above the storm, Emily Carter was fighting for consciousness. Every turn now was a battle not just against the enemy, but against the gray tunnel closing in on her vision, against arms that had gone from burning to numb, against a body 4 years out of practice that had given everything it had and was now running on nothing but the memory of 11 friends and the sound of young voices calling her name on the radio. She had 2 enemies left, and on any other day, in any other condition, 2 enemies would have been nothing to her. But she was empty, and they weren't. The 2 surviving pilots, the best of the 6, the ones who'd survived precisely because they were careful and disciplined and deadly, came at her now with everything they had. And this time there was no storm to hide in, no sheer to steer them into, no clever trick left in the bag. Just skill against skill and clear air, and Emily Carter had spent all of hers. They caught her in a scissors, one high, one low, working her back and forth between them, and for the first time in the entire fight, Emily was reacting, instead of dictating, defending instead of attacking. And both she and the enemy knew it, and the 2 pilots pressed their advantage with the desperate ferocity of men who had watched this woman kill 4 of their brothers and wanted more than they had ever wanted anything to see her fall. Come on! Emily gasped, wrestling the aircraft through a defensive turn that used the last of her energy. Come on, not like this. Not after all of it. Torres, Chen, Bishop, somebody, help me. I can't. I don't have anything left. And on the ground, they heard it. They heard Phantom Shadow, the ghost pilot, the woman who had faced 6 alone without a tremor in her voice, finally sound tired, finally sound afraid, finally sound human. And it went through the whole base like a blade, because if she was afraid, then it was real, then she could actually die up there. Then the impossible thing they'd been cheering might have a different ending than the one they'd let themselves start to believe in. Colonel Reyes grabbed the radio himself. Phantom Shadow, this is Raven Peak Actual. His voice shook. He didn't care. Emily, listen to me. The alert wing is 7 minutes out. 7 minutes. You don't have to win. You just have to live. Break off, disengage, run, and stay alive and let them come to you. Do you hear me? You've done enough. You've done more than enough. Just live. And Emily Carter being hunted through the sky by the 2 deadliest pilots she'd faced all day, with nothing left in her arms and gray closing in on her sight, heard the colonel's voice, heard the word enough, and thought about the last time someone had told her she'd done enough. 4 years ago, after the mission, when they pinned the medal on her and told her she'd saved 300 lives and done enough, more than enough, and she'd gone home and taken off her flight suit and never worn it again, because enough was the loneliest word in the language when you were the only one left to hear it. No, she whispered, and then on the open channel so the whole base heard it. No, Colonel. I ran once, I flew away, and I let them tell me I'd done enough, and I've spent 4 years dying of it. I'm not running today. Not from 2, not from anybody. Not ever again. And with the last of everything she had, Emily Carter stopped defending. She reversed her turn straight into the 2 of them, into the teeth of the scissors, a move so aggressive and so hopeless and so utterly without regard for her own survival that both enemy pilots flinched just for an instant because nothing in their training had prepared them for an opponent who was completely out of energy and coming straight at them anyway, an opponent who had stopped trying to live and started trying only to make them pay. That flinch was all she needed. The low fighter broke first, hauling away from her head-on charge on pure animal instinct, And in braking, he crossed in front of his own wingman. And for 1/100th of a second, the geometry of three aircraft in the sky lined up into a single perfect, impossible solution that only a pilot who had flown for 30 years and cleaned floors for 4 could ever have seen coming. Emily took it. Flash. 1 track left. And then Emily Carter's aircraft and the single surviving enemy fighter hung alone together in the clear blue sky above the storm. 2 pilots, 1 bullet of fuel and strength between them. 4 years of grief and 1 afternoon of impossible courage, circling each other in the sudden silence, with the whole base holding its breath below, and the alert wings still 6 minutes out, and everything coming down to the 2 of them, and the last turn either one of them would ever fly. 1 against 1. The way it had begun in the enemy's minds, 6 against 1, had inverted itself entirely, and now the last man of a formation that had come to erase Raven Peak from the map found himself alone in the sky, with the woman who had erased everyone else instead. Emily Carter had nothing left. She knew it with total clarity. Her arms were dead weight. Her vision was a shrinking circle. She had at most 1 more real maneuver in her 1 last turn, and then her body would simply stop obeying her, and whatever happened after that would happen without her being able to do anything about it. The enemy pilot knew something too. He knew he was the last. He had watched over the span of 11 minutes a single defender dismantle a formation of 6 of the best pilots his country could field, and now it was just him, and there was a terror in that which no amount of training could touch. He was not fighting an aircraft anymore. He was fighting a legend, a ghost, a thing that did not seem to run out of tricks or courage or mercy, and the not running out was the most frightening part of all. And Emily, because she was who she was, keyed the radio 1 more time and spoke to him gently the way she'd been speaking to all of them since the first pass, the way she spoke to frightened young pilots on the edge of a mistake. "You're the last one," she said. "You know that. You watched it happen. 5 of your friends are gone, and I'm still here, and you cannot beat me. Not today. Not in my sky." She paused, and her breath rasped in the mask, and even that exhaustion somehow made her words heavier, not lighter. "But I don't want you dead. I have watched enough people die. I have buried a whole squadron, and I have carried them every day for 4 years, and I am so tired of watching young men fall out of the sky. So I'm going to give you what nobody gave me, a way to live. Turn around. Fly home. Tell them what happened here. Tell them there was 1 defender, and she was enough." There was silence on the channel. In the control center, no one breathed. On the flight line, no one moved. The whole base hung suspended on the answer of a man they'd never met, a man Emily Carter was trying to save even now, even empty, even a heartbeat away from her own body failing her. And then the enemy fighter's track on the radar began to turn, away, toward the border, toward home. He ran. He broke off and he dove and he fled the sky over Colorado as fast as his aircraft could carry him, and Emily Carter watched him go on her display and did not chase, could not chase, would not have chased, even if she'd had the strength, because she had meant every word, because the whole point of all of it, the whole point of 11 minutes of impossible flying had been to send someone home instead of watching them fall. "That's it," she breathed. "That's the last one. They're gone. It's over." And the control center did not erupt. That was the strange thing, the thing every person in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. They did not cheer. They did not shout. A silence fell over that room deeper and more total than any silence a crisis had ever produced. Because a cheer is what you give when your team scores, and this was not that. This was the silence you give in the presence of something holy. Grown officers stood with tears running openly down their faces and made no sound at all. Colonel Reyes lowered the radio in a hand that would not stop shaking and put his other hand over his eyes and wept without a single sound. And no one looked away, and no one thought less of him because half the room was doing the same. Daniel Brooks was the one who finally spoke, and his voice came out cracked and wondering barely above a whisper. "She sent the last one home," he said. "She had him. She had him dead to rights, empty, exhausted, and she let him live. She let all of them have the chance, and she let the last one take it." He turned to Reyes, and his face was that of a man who has had every assumption about the world rearranged in the span of a quarter hour. "Who is she, Colonel? Not the call sign, not the file. Who is a person who does that? Who fights like the devil for 11 minutes and spends the whole time trying to save the men she's fighting?" Reyes lowered his hand from his eyes. He looked at the radar at the single friendly track alone, now in a clear and empty sky, turning slowly back toward home. She's what all of us pretend to be, Reyes said quietly, and almost none of us are. She's the real thing, Daniel, the genuine article. And we made her clean our floors for 4 years and never even learned her name. But it was not over. Not quite. Because the fight had been won, and now the far more dangerous thing began, which was the getting home. Up in the clearing sky, Emily Carter felt the adrenaline that had carried her through 11 minutes of combat begin all at once to drain out of her body, and what it left behind was a devastation of fatigue so complete that she nearly lost consciousness right there straight and leveled the enemy already fled. Her vision swam. Her hands, which had done such impossible things, now trembled so violently she could barely hold the controls. She had spent 4 years' worth of strength in 11 minutes, and there was quite simply nothing left in the tank of her body. Raven Peak, she said, and her voice had changed, gone thin and unsteady, the calm finally cracking now that the danger to others had passed. Raven Peak, this is Phantom Shadow. Threats are clear. All hostiles down or departed. She stopped, swallowed. I'm in trouble. I've got nothing left. I don't know if I can get this thing on the ground. The control center, which had been drowning in reverent silence, snapped back into motion so fast it was almost violent. Say again, Phantom Shadow. Reyes was on the radio instantly, the grief in his voice replaced by the sharp focus of a commander with a pilot in danger. Talk to me, Emily. What's your status? Status is I'm 45 years old and I just fought 6 people after 4 years off, Emily said, and there was a ghost of dark humor in it, the gallows laugh of a pilot who has always joked at the worst moments. My arms are done, Colonel, just done. The storm's still between me and the field, and I flew through it fresh. I don't know if I can fly through it wrung out like this. If that shear catches me low and I can't muscle out of it. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Everyone in the control center knew how that sentence ended. Reyes looked at the radar. Between Emily and the runway sat the storm cells, still churning the same weather that had been her weapon minutes ago, now transformed into the last enemy standing between her and safety, and she was too weak to fight it. Then you don't fly through it, Reyes said. You go around. I don't care how long it takes. We've got fuel data on. You got the margin if you go around the south edge. Slow and gentle, Emily. No more heroics. You already saved everybody. Now let me get you home. Let me get you down. And Emily Carter, who had spent 4 years believing she deserved to be alone, who had convinced herself that the kindest thing she could do for the world was to disappear from it, heard the colonel of an entire air base plead with her to come home, heard the whole weight of a base full of people who suddenly desperately wanted her to live, and something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 4 years, began painfully to thaw. Okay, she whispered. Okay, Colonel. South edge. Slow and gentle. I'll try. Down on the flight line, the word passed through the crowd. It gave like a cold wind. She won. She won, and now she might not make it home. And the celebration that had been building died in every throat, and the crowd that had gathered to witness a triumph now stood in the gathering dread of watching a hero possibly die on the way back from her own victory. Sergeant Ellis put his hat back on and walked fast toward the fire and rescue vehicles, shouting for the crews to stage to be ready to pray. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen with her hand over her mouth, and Jason Miller, Captain Jason Miller, who 12 hours ago had shoved this woman into a toolbox, broke away from the crowd and ran flat out across the tarmac toward the control center because he could not stand on the sidelines 1 second longer, because he had to do something, anything, even if all he could do was be in the room. He burst through the door of the control center just as Emily's aircraft began its slow, careful arc around the southern edge of the storm, and Reyes turned to bark at the intruder, and then saw who it was and said nothing, because the look on Jason Miller's face was not the face of the arrogant young pilot from the ready room. It was the face of a boy who had just watched the world turn out to be entirely different than he'd believed. Is she going to make it? Jason said. His voice was barely working. Colonel, please, is she going to make it? I don't know, son, Reyes said. And that honesty from a colonel to a captain told Jason everything about how bad it was. Up in the sky, Emily Carter fought the last and hardest fight of the day, which was not against an enemy, but against her own failing body. Every small correction the aircraft needed, every gentle nudge on the controls to keep the arc smooth around the storm, cost her more than it should have. Her arms had stopped being reliable. Twice her vision tunneled down to almost nothing, and she had to breathe through it, force the blood back up, talk herself out of the dark. "Stay with me," she muttered. "Stay with me, old woman. You didn't come back to the sky just to fall out of it on the easy part." And then softer to the ghost who had never left her bishop, "You always said I was too stubborn to die. Let's find out if you were right." She came around the southern edge of the storm, and the runway opened up ahead of her through the thinning gray, and the sight of it, that long, welcoming ribbon of concrete, put something back into her that the exhaustion had taken out. Home. Not the home she'd been hiding in for 4 years. A different home. The one she'd sworn off. The sky and the ground beneath it, and the people on that ground who now knew her name. "Raven Peak," she said. "Phantom Shadow is on final. I'm going to try to put her down. If I don't," she paused, "if I don't, you tell those young pilots something for me. You tell them the loudest one in the room is almost never the strongest. And you tell them the quiet ones are quiet because they've already seen what happens when you're not. Will you tell them that Colonel by Fiabuam?" "You're going to tell them yourself," Reyes said fiercely. "You hear me, Emily? You're going to walk into that academy and tell them yourself. Now bring my airplane home." And in the control center, and on the flight line, and in the fire truck staged along the runway, and in the ready room, where a dozen young pilots who had mocked her now stood in silent, shattered awe. The entire population of Raven Peak Air Force Base watched a single of 35 descend out of a clearing, wobbling fighting flown by a pair of arms with nothing left in them, and a heart that refused to quit. The wheels reached for the runway. And Emily, Carter the janitor. Nobody had noticed the ghost pilot. They'd all forgotten the woman who had gone alone into the sky against 6 and sent the last one home alive. Gathered the very last of everything she had left in the world, and reached down through 4 years of grief and 11 minutes of impossible courage, and one final descent, and flew her aircraft the last 100 feet to the ground she'd sworn she would never fight to return to. The tires touched the concrete, and the whole base, every soul on it, rose to their feet as one and did not make a sound, waiting, praying, hoping as the aircraft rolled down the runway carrying the most extraordinary person any of them had ever known. And nobody breathed and nobody moved, and time itself seemed to hold still over Raven Peak, waiting to learn whether the legend would live. The aircraft rolled to a stop. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened, and those 3 seconds were the longest of Colonel Reyes's life. The canopy stayed shut. The engine wound down, and in the control center and on the flight line, a base full of people who had just watched Emily Carter do the impossible now stood frozen, terrified that the woman inside that cockpit had given her last breath to the last 100 feet of runway and had nothing left to open the canopy with. "Come on," Reyes whispered, his knuckles white on the console. "Come on, Emily, show me. Show me you're in there." The canopy opened, slowly, painfully, but it opened, and a gloved hand reached up over the edge of the cockpit, and then a helmet, and Emily Carter, moving like a woman 3 times her age, pulled herself upright in the seat and sat there in the open air alive, and the entire base let out a breath. It had been holding for 11 minutes in one impossible landing. And then the sound came. It started somewhere on the flight line, a single voice, and then it spread and it grew. And within seconds, the whole base was roaring a sound that rolled across the tarmac and echoed off the mountains. Hundreds of people cheering and crying and screaming her name, the name most of them had learned less than an hour ago. Phantom Shadow, Phantom Shadow, Phantom Shadow. Emily sat in the cockpit and heard it, and she didn't understand it at first. 4 years of being invisible had trained something out of her, the ability to believe that a crowd could be cheering for her. She looked down at the ocean of faces flooding toward the aircraft at the fire crews, and the crew chiefs, and the young pilots, and the officers, and she saw that every one of them was looking up at her. And something broke open in her chest that had been sealed for 4 years. And Emily Carter, who had not cried in front of another human being since the day her squadron died, put her hand over her mouth and wept. Sergeant Ellis reached the aircraft first. He climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time faster than a man his age had any business moving. And when he got to the top, he didn't salute, didn't speak. He just reached into the cockpit and took Emily Carter's trembling hand in both of his weathered ones and held it and looked at her, and his own face was wet. "Ma'am," he said, "in 22 years, I have never seen anything like what I just saw. Not in training, not in war, not anywhere. There is not a pilot alive who could have done what you just did." His voice cracked completely. And we made you clean our floors. Sergeant, Emily said weakly, and even now, even wrung out to nothing, there was warmth in it. You cleared my ladder when I needed it cleared. That's all a pilot ever really needs. Somebody to clear the ladder. She squeezed his hands. Now help an old woman down. My legs aren't going to do this alone. Ellis helped her out of the cockpit. And when Emily Carter's boots touched the ground when she stood on the tarmac swaying, held up on one side by an old sergeant, the crowd surged forward and then stopped all at once, as if some collective instinct told them that this woman had given enough of herself today and did not need to be swarmed. They formed a wide circle around her, instead hundreds of them silent now, and they did the only thing that felt right. They saluted. Every uniform on that flight line came to attention and saluted the janitor. And Emily Carter stood in the center of it, barely able to stand, and looked around at all of them, and did not know what to do with her hands or her face or her heart. And then the circle parted, because Captain Jason Miller was pushing through it. The crowd went quiet in a different way. Now a wary way, because everyone on that flight line had seen what Jason Miller did to this woman that morning. They had seen the cart go into the wall. They had seen the water on her face. They had heard him scream that he'd have her thrown off the base by lunch. And now here he was, walking into the circle, walking toward her, and the whole base tensed, not knowing what was about to happen. Jason stopped in front of Emily Carter. For a long moment he couldn't speak. He looked at her, this small, exhausted woman held upright by a crew chief, and he thought about the toolbox and the laughter and 4 years of cruelty he'd been part of, and every excuse he'd ever made for himself turned to ash in his mouth. This morning, he finally said, and his voice was wrecked, I shoved you into a toolbox, in front of everybody. I threw your cart across the hangar, and I put water on your face, and I told you I'd have you fired. He was shaking. And 4 hours later, you climbed into my aircraft, and you flew alone against 6 people so that nobody else would ever have to. You sent Amanda Reyes home. You sent all of them home. You sent the last enemy home alive. His face crumpled. I have spent my whole career thinking I was the best scores, the best hands, and I stood on that tarmac today and I watched you do things I will study for the rest of my life and never come close to, and the whole time you were up there, you were trying to save the men, trying to kill you. He couldn't hold it anymore. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, ma'am. There's no way to make it right. I know there isn't. I just needed you to hear me say it. The whole base held its breath. Emily Carter looked at the young man in front of her, this arrogant boy who had humiliated her that very morning, and everyone waited to see what she would do. She would have been within every right to turn away from him, to let him drown in his shame, to make him carry it the way Sergeant Ellis had told him he would carry it for the rest of his days. Instead, Emily Carter did the thing that made half the crowd start crying all over again. She reached out with an arm that could barely lift, and she put her hand on Captain Jason Miller's shoulder. Jason, she said gently, look at me. He did through his tears. Everything you just said. That takes more courage than anything I did up there today. Do you understand me? Flying is easy for me. It's the one thing I know how to do. But standing in front of a whole base and admitting you were wrong out loud to the person you wronged, that's the hard thing. That's the thing most men never manage in their whole lives. She tightened her grip on his shoulder. You have the makings of a good pilot. I saw your scores mentioned in the ready room. But scores don't make you a good pilot. This does. What you just did. This is where good pilots actually come from. Jason Miller broke down completely, and Emily Carter, exhausted, barely standing, pulled the young man who had shoved her into a toolbox that morning into an embrace and held him while he cried, and the crowd of hundreds around them dissolved into tears. And up in the control center, Colonel Reyes watched it through the window and shook his head slowly and said to no one, my God, she's still saving people. She landed 5 minutes ago and she's still saving people. But the day was not done delivering its shocks, because through the crowd now came another figure walking fast, and this one made the crowd part with a different energy entirely. It was Captain Amanda Reyes, the flight lead Emily had sent home first, the colonel's own daughter still in her flight suit from the exercise, and she walked straight up to Emily Carter with an expression that no one could read. You, Amanda said. Her voice was tight. You're the voice. You're the one who came up on the radio when I had 4 aircraft low on fuel and enemies I couldn't see, and I was about to lose my mind. You're the one who told me every one of us was going home tonight. She stopped in front of Emily. You told me to take my flight and go. And I did. I left you up there alone against six because you told me to, and I have hated myself for it every second since, because I'm the flight lead, and I ran, and I left a single defender to do my job. Captain Emily started. Let me finish, Amanda said, and her voice cracked. My father is up in that tower. He's been a pilot for 30 years. And when I was a little girl, he used to tell me stories about the pilots he admired most. And there was one he'd tell me about more than any other. A pilot who once flew into something so bad, they burned the records of it. A pilot who saved hundreds of people on the ground and lost her whole squadron doing it and then disappeared. Tears were streaming down Amanda's face now. He said her call sign was Phantom Shadow. And he said if I was ever half the pilot she was, he'd die a proud man. I grew up on stories about you. You were the reason I flew. And I have spent my whole career trying to be worthy of a woman I thought was dead. She was sobbing now. And today you saved my life. The pilot I've worshipped since I was 6 years old came up on my radio and saved my life. And I didn't even know it was you. The crowd was in pieces. There was not a dry eye anywhere on that flight line. And Emily Carter, who had spent 4 years believing that her story had ended, that the world had forgotten her, that Phantom Shadow was a ghost who mattered to no one, learned in that moment that a little girl had grown up on her legend, had become a fighter pilot because of her, had been trying her whole life to be worthy of the very woman she'd just left behind in the sky. Emily reached out and took Amanda Race's face in her hands. You didn't run, Emily said fiercely. You hear me? You didn't run. You followed an order from someone who'd been where you were and knew what needed to happen. That's not cowardice, Amanda. That's discipline. That's the hardest thing a leader ever does, trusting someone else to carry the weight so you can protect your people. You got 4 pilots home alive today. 4. That's the whole job. That's the only job. She smiled through her own tears. And your father was wrong about one thing. You're not half the pilot I am. The way you held that flight together when everything went dark at your age with what you had, you're already better than I was. Tell him I said so. Tell him Phantom Shadow said his daughter is the real thing. And up in the tower, Colonel Reyes, who could see all of this but could not hear it, watched his daughter and his childhood hero embrace on the tarmac, and this hard old warrior of 200 missions put both hands over his face and wept like a boy. 20 minutes later, the alert wing finally arrived, 6 fresh fighters screaming in from the neighboring base to defend an airspace that one woman had already cleared alone. They circled the field, confused, radioing the tower for the threats they'd been scrambled against, and Reyes had to tell them in a voice thick with emotion that there were no threats, that the situation was resolved, that a single defender had handled 6 advanced hostiles and sent the survivor home before the cavalry could even arrive. The lead pilot of the alert wing, a hardened major with combat time, refused to believe it. Say again, Raven Peak, 1 defender against 6. That's not possible. Who was the defender? What squadron? No squadron, Reyes said. 1 pilot. Call sign Phantom Shadow. There was a long silence on the radio, and then the alert wing major's voice came back. Changed quiet, almost frightened. Phantom Shadow is a story we tell in the ready room, he said. Phantom Shadow isn't real. Phantom Shadow died 4 years ago. No, Colonel Reyes said, and he looked down through the tower window at the small figure on the tarmac, surrounded by hundreds of saluting airmen. Phantom Shadow's been cleaning our floors for 4 years, and today she came back. That evening, after the medical team had checked Emily over and pronounced her exhausted but whole after the debriefs had begun, and the investigation into the radar failure had been launched, and after the young pilots had been sent to quarters and the flight line had finally gone quiet, Emily Carter sat alone in a small office with Colonel Reyes and Major Daniel Brooks, and the 3 of them talked, and the last pieces of the mystery came apart. The radar failure, Brooks said. It wasn't an accident, was it? And those 6 fighters showing up in exactly the blind spot the failure created at exactly the moment it happened. That's not a coincidence. No, Emily said quietly, it's not. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than the day's exhaustion. Somebody wanted that radar down. Somebody who knew the exact timing fault to induce and knew that when the backups slaved to the same clock they'd cascade. That's not information a foreign Air Force has, Major. That's information somebody on the inside gave them. She met Brooks's eyes. You've been trying to solve the mystery of me for months, but there's a much more dangerous mystery on this base than a janitor with a past. Somebody here helped those aircraft find the door, and they're still here. The room went cold. Brooks and Reyes exchanged a look. Because she was right. The failure had been too precise, the timing too perfect. The enemy's exploitation of the blind spot too immediate. Someone inside Raven Peak had opened the door for 6 enemy fighters to come through, and that someone had watched the whole thing unfold and was right now somewhere on this base realizing that their plan had failed for one reason and one reason only. A janitor had been standing in the wrong corridor at the right time. "They didn't plan for you," Reyes said slowly, staring at Emily. "Whoever did this. They planned for a blind base and a scattered wing, and no one able to see the threat until it was too late. They planned for everything, except a former combat legend pushing a mop 40 feet from the control center." Which means, Brooks said, and his security officer's mind was already racing ahead, that whoever did this now knows that Emily Carter is the reason they failed. And whoever's willing to help enemy fighters attack an American airbase is not going to be happy that one person ruined it. He looked at Emily and his voice dropped. "You didn't just win a dogfight today. You made yourself the single biggest threat to a traitor who's still walking around this base. You saved everyone up there, but you might have just painted a target on your own back down here." Emily Carter was quiet for a long moment, and then slowly the exhaustion in her face gave way to something else, something the two men recognized because they'd seen it on the radar screens that afternoon. The cold, clear, bottomless calm of a woman who has already faced the worst thing that will ever happen to her and has nothing left to fear. "Good," Emily said softly. Both men looked at her. "Good," Brooks repeated. "For 4 years," Emily said, "I've been running from what I am, hiding, cleaning floors, telling myself the kindest thing I could do was disappear, telling myself the world was safer without me making decisions that get people killed." She stood up from her chair, and though her body was ruined with fatigue, something in her spine was straight and certain in a way it hadn't been in 4 years. "But I watched what happens when I disappear. I watched a base almost fall because the one person who could see the threat had convinced herself she didn't belong in the room. Never again." She looked from Brooks to Reyes and back. "Somebody on this base opened the door for those fighters. Somebody was willing to let every pilot in that exercise die, willing to let Raven Peak burn to serve whoever's paying them. And they think the danger's past. They think the janitor's just going to go back to her mop." She walked to the door and put her hand on the handle, and she turned back, and for the first time since the day her squadron died, Emily Carter smiled a smile with no grief in it at all. Only purpose. "Let them think that," she said. "Let them think I'm just the janitor. It worked out pretty well for everybody the last time somebody underestimated me." And she opened the door and paused on the threshold and delivered the words that would send both men to their feet. "Find me the flight recordings from every aircraft in that exercise. Find me the maintenance logs on the radar array for the last 30 days. And find me the personnel list of everyone who had access to the timing systems. Because I flew into hell today to save the people on this base. And I'll be damned if I let one of them get away with trying to sell it to the enemy." She stepped through the door. "The war in the sky is over, gentlemen. But the one down here just started. And whoever they are, they should have run when they had the chance. Everybody who doesn't run from me eventually wishes they had." The door closed behind her, and Colonel Reyes and Major Daniel Brooks sat in the silence she'd left two hardened men who had thought the day's shocks were finally over and realized that the woman they'd underestimated for 4 years had just walked out of the room to hunt a traitor with the same cold certainty she'd used to hunt 6 fighters through a storm, and that whoever had opened that door was right now somewhere on Raven Peak going about their evening with no idea at all that the janitor they'd never noticed was already coming for them. That night, Emily Carter did not go home. For 4 years, she had left the base at the end of every shift, driven her old truck to the far edge of town and shut the door of her small apartment against the world. Tonight, she stayed. She sat in a borrowed office with a stack of flight recordings and maintenance logs and a personnel list, and she worked through the small hours with the same relentless focus she'd once brought to a target folder, and Daniel Brooks sat across from her, and neither of them slept. "You know what you're looking for," Brooks said around 2 in the morning. It wasn't a question. He'd been watching her work for hours, watching the way her eyes moved down columns of data, and he'd realized she wasn't reading it the way an investigator reads. She was reading it the way she'd read the schema. I know what it feels like, Emily said, not looking up. The failure was too clean, Major. Real sabotage is messy. It leaves fingerprints. This didn't. This was surgical, which means whoever did it knew exactly how much to touch and exactly how much to leave alone. She turned a page. That's not a technician following instructions from a handler overseas. That's someone who understands this system down to the bone. Someone who's been here a long time. Someone we'd never suspect because they're too good at their job. She finally looked up and her eyes were flat and cold. The best traders always are. Brooks felt a chill. You're describing half my senior maintenance staff. I'm describing one of them, Emily said. I just haven't found which one yet. By dawn, she had. It was in the maintenance logs buried where no one would think to look a single entry from 11 days before the attack. A routine recalibration of the radar timing system, logged and signed off completely. Ordinary, the kind of entry that scrolled past 100 sets of eyes without registering. Except Emily had spent the night learning the rhythm of these logs the way she'd once learned the rhythm of enemy formations, and she saw the thing that was wrong. This recalibration, she said, sliding the log across the desk. Read the timestamp. Brooks read it. Oh, 3:40, middle of the night. Nobody recalibrates a radar timing system at 0340, Emily said. There's no reason to. The system's not in use, sure, but you don't schedule delicate work for the middle of the night when you're alone and unsupervised, unless being alone and unsupervised is the entire point. She tapped the signature line. Whose name is that? Brooks looked, and his face changed. Master Sergeant Kowalski, he said slowly. He's been here 9 years. Brooks stopped. He's one of the most trusted men on this base. He trains the other technicians. He's got commendations. He's the last person anybody would ever. He's the only person it could be, Emily said quietly. Trusted senior, technically brilliant above suspicion. That recalibration didn't fix the timing system, Major. It planted the fault. 11 days early dormant waiting, set to trigger on a specific command during a specific window. The window of yesterday's exercise. He didn't break the radar during the attack. He'd already broken it. He just armed it, and then he waited, and then when the enemy was inbound, he pulled the trigger and let it cascade. She sat back, and then he stood in that maintenance bay and watched us scramble to fix a failure he designed, knowing exactly why we'd never find the cause in time. He watched a base full of his own people get ready to die, and he never blinked. The two of them sat with the weight of it. There's something else, Emily said, and now her voice dropped lower. Whoever's paying Kowalski knows the attack failed. And they know it failed because of Mivaki, which means Kowalski knows it too. And a man who's willing to sell out an entire airbase is not going to sit quietly and wait to be arrested. She looked at Brooks. He's going to run. Today. This morning, probably before the investigation gets any closer. And if he can't run clean, he's going to try to take out the one thing that ruined his operation on the way out. She stood. Where is he right now, Major? Brooks was already reaching for the phone, but before he could dial it rang. He answered it, listened, and Emily watched his face go pale. Say that again, Brooks said. When? A pause. Where is he now? Another pause longer. He hung up the phone slowly and looked at Emily. Kowalski didn't show up for his shift this morning, first time in 9 years, and 20 minutes ago one of the fuel trucks went missing from the flight line motor pool. Brooks stood up. A fuel truck, Emily, on a flight line, full of jet fuel, with half the wing's aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. Emily was already moving toward the door. He's not running, she said. He's finishing the job. If he can't let the enemy destroy the base, he's going to do it himself. One fuel truck into a row of parked fighters, and this whole flight line goes up. She was out the door and down the hall at a dead run, Brooks scrambling after her, and even exhausted, even wrung out from the day before Emily Carter moved with the terrible economy of a person who had spent her whole life running toward the thing everyone else ran from. They came out onto the flight line into the gray light of dawn, and there it was. The fuel truck moving slow and deliberate down the taxiway toward the long row of parked F-35s, dozens of aircraft lined up in perfect formation, the entire striking power of Raven Peak Air Force Base, and one man in a stolen truck full of fuel driving straight at the heart of it. He's going to ram the line, Brooks said. Emily, if that truck reaches those aircraft. I know. Security can't get there in time. The truck's already past the checkpoint. There's nothing between him and the aircraft but open taxiway. I know, Major. And Emily Carter looked around the flight line at the fuel truck bearing down on the parked fighters, at the security vehicles too far away, at the whole disaster unfolding in slow motion in front of her, and her eyes landed on the one thing that could stop it. A tow tractor. The heavy tug used to move aircraft sitting idle by the maintenance hangar engine still warm from the morning's work. She ran for it. Emily, Brooks shouted, "What are you doing?" But she was already in the seat, already gunning the engine, already swinging the heavy tug out onto the taxiway, and Brooks understood with horror what she meant to do, because there was only one thing she could do, the same thing she'd done the day before, the same thing she'd been doing her whole life. She was going to put herself between the danger and the people her own body one more time, because that was the only language Emily Carter had ever really spoken. The tug was slower than the fuel truck, but it didn't have to be faster. It only had to reach the intercept point first, and Emily had spent 30 years calculating intercepts in 3 dimensions at the speed of sound, and doing it on the ground in 2 dimensions with a tow tractor was for her almost simple. She saw the geometry. She saw where the truck would be, and she drove the heavy tug straight into that spot and stopped it broadside across the taxiway, a wall of steel between the fuel truck and the parked aircraft, and then she did the only thing left to do. She stayed in the seat, because if she got out and ran, Kowalski would simply swerve around the tug and the whole thing would be for nothing. The only way to stop a man willing to die was to make him believe you were willing to die too. So Emily Carter sat in the seat of a tow tractor directly in the path of a fuel truck driven by a desperate traitor, and she did not move, and she keyed the tug's radio to the base frequency, and she spoke calm as ever, calm as she'd been against 6 fighters in a storm. "Kowalski," her voice went out across the flight line, across the whole base. "This is the janitor, the one who was standing 40 feet from the control center when you pulled your trigger. The one who ruined 9 years of your work in 11 minutes yesterday. I'm sitting in a tow tractor directly in your path, and I am not going to move." A pause. "You can stop this truck, and you can face what you've done like a man. Or you can drive through me and add murder to treason and still not reach those aircraft because there's a security cordon forming behind me right now, and you'll be dead before you clear the wreckage." Her voice never wavered. "I've already died once, Kowalski. 4 years ago in a sky you'll never understand. So the fear you're counting on, the fear that makes people move out of your way, I don't have it. I gave it up a long time ago. Now stop the truck." The fuel truck kept coming. On the flight line, hundreds of people who had gathered at the sound of the alarm watched a woman in a borrowed tow tractor sit motionless in the path of a fuel truck, and Sergeant Ellis screamed her name, and Sarah Mitchell covered her eyes, and Colonel Reyes came sprinting out of the tower, shouting into his radio for the truck to stop. And Jason Miller, who had slept on a cot in the ready room because he couldn't bear to leave, ran out onto the tarmac and stopped dead at the sight of the woman he'd wronged, sitting once again between everyone else and death. "Move!" Jason screamed at her uselessly, too far away. "Emily, move! Get out of the way! Move!" But she didn't move. The fuel truck bore down on the tow tractor. 50 feet, 40, and Emily Carter sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the windshield of the oncoming truck, on the face of the man behind it, and she let him see her. She let Kowalski see that she was not going to flinch, not going to run, not going to give him the fear he needed. She looked into his eyes across the closing distance with the absolute stillness of a woman who had made her peace with dying a long time ago, and she dared him silently to be the thing he'd have to become to drive through her. 30 feet, 20. And at the last possible instant, at the moment of no return, Master Sergeant Kowalski staring into the face of a woman who would not move, who was not afraid, who had already outflown 6 of the enemy's best and now sat calmly waiting to rather than let him win, could not do it. He stood on the brakes. The fuel truck skidded, shuddered, and slammed to a halt with its bumper inches from the tow tractor, close enough that Emily could see the man's face clearly now, and what she saw on it was not defiance. It was collapse. The collapse of a man whose nerve had finally broken against something harder than himself, against a woman who had nothing left to lose, and therefore could not be threatened with losing it. The security cordon closed in behind. It was over. Emily Carter climbed down from the tow tractor slowly, her legs unsteady, and she walked to the door of the fuel truck as the security officers pulled Kowalski from behind the wheel, and she looked at the man who had tried twice now to destroy everything, once with the enemy, and once with his own hands, and she did not scream at him, did not strike him, did not gloat. She just looked at him with a sadness so deep it silenced everyone around them. 9 years, she said quietly. 9 years these people trusted you. Ellis cleared airplanes beside you. These kids learned their trade from you. And you were going to let every one of them burn. She shook her head slowly. I've watched good pilots die, Kowalski. 11 of them. Friends. People I'd have traded my life for without a second's thought. And you were going to throw away a whole base full of people who trusted you for money. For nothing. She stepped back and let the security officers take him. I hope whoever paid you was worth it. Because you just traded your soul for it and you didn't even get the base. They led him away in handcuffs and the flight line watched in silence. And then slowly the crowd turned to Emily Carter, and once again for the second time in 2 days they saluted her. But this time Emily Carter did not stand there awkwardly, not knowing what to do with the honor. This time she straightened her spine and she looked around at all of them, at the young pilots and the crew chiefs and the officers and the woman who'd once brought her coffee on a cold morning, and Emily Carter, former commander of Phantom Squadron, the ghost pilot who had come back to the sky and then come back to the ground to save them all a second time, raised her own hand and returned the salute. And Colonel Reyes, standing at the edge of the crowd with tears on his face, turned to Daniel Brooks and said the thing they were all thinking. We spent 4 years walking past her, he said, and in 2 days she saved this base twice, in the air and on the ground, against an enemy and against a traitor. He shook his head slowly. I don't think we deserved her, Daniel. But by God, I'm never going to let us forget her again. The story could not be contained after that. For 2 days, Raven Peak had held its breath and kept its secret, but a thing like this does not stay quiet. By the end of the week, the classified files that had buried Emily Carter 4 years earlier were being pulled off shelves in Washington by people who suddenly needed to understand how a woman they declared retired had single-handedly defended an American airbase against 6 advanced fighters and then stopped an insider attack with a tow tractor. The investigation into Kowalski unraveled a network that reached far beyond one base, and it was Emily's night of poring over maintenance logs that gave the counterintelligence people the thread they pulled to bring the whole thing down. But Emily Carter didn't care about any of that. She sat in Colonel Reyes' office a week after the attack, and across the desk from her sat Reyes and a 2-star general who had flown in from the Pentagon specifically to speak with her, and the general laid out in careful official language everything the Air Force wanted to give her. Reinstatement at her former rank, and then some. Command of a squadron. Medals to add to the ones she'd never worn. A future built on the wreckage of the past she'd tried to leave behind. You disappeared 4 years ago, the general said. The Air Force let you disappear because after what happened, we thought you had earned the right to be left alone. But we were wrong to lose you. Do you understand what you are, Colonel Carter? Do you understand how rare it is? There are maybe 5 pilots alive who could have done what you did in that squadron, and you did it after 4 years off in a borrowed aircraft, exhausted alone. He leaned forward. The country needs you back. Name your command. It's yours. Emily Carter listened to all of it, and when the general finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked a question that stopped the room. How many of them did I save today? She said. This week, since I came back. The general blinked. I'm sorry. The pilots in that exercise, Emily said. Amanda Reyes and her flight, the base. The people on this flight line who'd have burned if Kowalski reached those aircraft. How many roughly? Hundreds, Reyes said quietly. Hundreds, Emily. Hundreds, Emily repeated. She nodded slowly to herself. And 4 years ago on the mission, you burned the records of how many did I save on the ground. 311, Reyes said. He knew the number by heart. Every pilot who'd heard the story knew the number. 311, Emily said, and I lost 11 pilots doing it. 11 people I loved. Her voice didn't break, but something in it went very still and very deep. For 4 years, General, I have done that math every single day. 311 saved, 11 lost. And every day I told myself the 11 outweighed the 311 because the 11 were mine and the 311 were strangers. She looked up. That's why I disappeared. Not because I couldn't fly, because I couldn't stand to be responsible for anyone's life ever again. Because I decided that the safest thing, the kindest thing, was to take myself out of the equation entirely so no one would ever die because of a decision I made. The room was silent. And then I stood in a corridor 2 weeks ago, Emily continued, and I watched what happens when the person who can see the threat has removed herself from the room. I watched a base almost fall because I'd spent 4 years hiding from what I am. She shook her head. So no, General. I understand what you're offering. Command. A squadron of my own. And I'm telling you I don't want it. Not because I'm afraid of it anymore, because I finally figured out what the math was really telling me. And what's that? The general asked. Emily Carter looked him dead in the eye. That one pilot in the right place at the right time can save hundreds, she said. Which means the most important thing I can do with whatever years I have left isn't to be that one pilot. It's to make 100 of them. It's to take everything I learned in the sky that killed my squadron, everything that let me walk out of it, everything that let me come back after 4 years and beat 6 fighters in a storm, and pour it into the young ones before they ever have to learn it the way I did, in blood. Her voice softened. I don't want a command general. I want the academy. I want the ones who haven't been broken yet. I want to teach. The general stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled and he stood and he did something a 2-star general almost never does. He came around the desk and he offered Emily Carter his hand, and when she took it, he held it in both of his. Colonel, he said, in 30 years I have never had someone turn down a command to teach, and I have never been prouder to have my offer refused. The academy is yours. Every young pilot in the United States Air Force is going to learn from Phantom Shadow. He tightened his grip. God knows they don't deserve it, but God knows they need it. Before Emily left Raven Peak for the last time, there were goodbyes. Sergeant Ellis found her by the hangar, where it had all started, the same hangar where Jason Miller had thrown her card against a $40 million aircraft 2 weeks and a lifetime ago. Ellis didn't say much. He wasn't a man of many words. He just took off his hat and held it against his chest and looked at her. 22 years I've been putting pilots in cockpits, ma'am, he said. And I want you to know something. I'm going to retire soon. And when they ask me, when my grandkids ask me, what's the most amazing thing you ever saw in all those years on the flight line, I'm not going to tell them about any air show or any general or any record. I'm going to tell them about the janitor. His voice cracked. I'm going to tell them about the day the janitor turned out to be the greatest pilot who ever lived and how I was lucky enough to clear her ladder. Emily took the old sergeant's hand. You did more than clear my ladder, Ellis, she said. For 4 years, you were one of about 3 people on this base who treated me like a human being. You didn't know who I was. You were kind to me anyway. That's rarer than anything I ever did in a cockpit. She squeezed his hand. Enjoy your retirement, Sergeant. You've earned every day of it. Sarah Mitchell found her next, and Sarah didn't try to say anything profound. She just hugged Emily hard, the way you hug someone you're afraid you'll never see again. And when she pulled back, her face was wet. I brought you coffee once, Sarah said, laughing through her tears, on a cold morning. And you looked at me like nobody had done anything nice for you in years. Nobody had, Emily said gently. That coffee, Sarah, you'll never know. On a morning when I'd convinced myself I'd made the whole world forget me, a stranger walked up and handed me a cup of coffee and treated me like I mattered. I went home that night and I cried, because I'd forgotten that I mattered. And you reminded me. She held Sarah's face the way she'd held Amanda Reyes's on the tarmac. Never stop doing that. Never stop being the person who brings the coffee. You have no idea whose life you're saving when you do. And then there was Jason Miller. He'd been waiting. Emily saw him standing apart from the others, twisting his cap in his hands, and she walked over to him, and the young captain who had once shoved her into a toolbox now could barely meet her eyes. I don't know how to say goodbye to you, Jason admitted. After everything I did, and everything you did, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you. You already said it, Emily told him, on the tarmac in front of the whole base. You said the hardest thing a person can say, and you said it out loud when you could have just let it go and let me leave and never faced it. She studied him. That's why I'm going to tell you something, Jason. Something I want you to carry with you for the rest of your career. You asked me on that tarmac how you get to be a good pilot. You thought it was scores. It's not. And it's not even flying. She stepped closer. It's this. The best pilot I ever flew with, a man named Torres, used to sing off-key over the radio until I made him stop. And Torres wasn't the best because of his hands. He was the best because when things went wrong, when everyone was scared, he was the one who thought about the other people first. Always, every time. The good ones aren't the ones who think they're invincible, Jason. The good ones are the ones who know they're not and go up anyway for somebody else. She put her hand on his shoulder one last time. You have that in you. I saw it come out on that tarmac. Now spend the rest of your life feeding it instead of starving it. Can you do that for me? Jason Miller couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face, and Emily Carter smiled at him. And for the first time, Jason understood that the woman he'd spent 4 years mocking had just given him the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. A map to becoming the man he'd only pretended it to be. Months later, Emily Carter stood at the front of a classroom at the United States Air Force Academy, and she looked out at a room full of young pilots. They were so young. That was the thing that struck her every time. So young and so certain, and so much like the ones she'd lost, and so much like Jason Miller had been before the sky humbled him. They looked at her, this small woman with gray coming into her hair, and she knew what most of them were thinking because she'd read the doubt on faces her whole life. They were thinking, who is this? What can this quiet, ordinary-looking woman possibly teach us? She let them think it. She'd earned the right to enjoy that particular silence. My name is Emily Carter, she said. Some of you may have heard a story about a pilot they called Phantom Shadow. A pilot who flew into something so bad they burned the records. A pilot who saved 311 people and lost her whole squadron and then vanished. She paused and let it land. That story is true, and I'm the pilot, and I disappeared for 4 years, and during those 4 years, I pushed a cleaning cart down the halls of an air base, and every single person on that base walked past me 1,000 times and never once saw me. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was nobody. They thought a person in a gray uniform pushing a mop had nothing to teach anyone about combat aviation. The room had gone very still. They were wrong, Emily said, and that's the first lesson, the most important lesson, the one that will keep you alive when nothing else will. She stepped out from behind the lectern and walked slowly along the front row, looking each young pilot in the eye. Never underestimate the person standing beside you, the mechanic, the controller, the one who doesn't talk much, the one who doesn't look impressive. The quietest person in the room is very often quiet because they have already seen the thing you're all still afraid of and survived it and don't feel the need to talk about it. She stopped at the center of the room. The day you decide you're the smartest person in any room, the strongest, the best, the day you look at someone and decide they have nothing to offer you because of how they look or what they wear or what job they do, that is the day you become a danger to everyone who flies with you. Because you will miss the warning. You will miss the person who could have saved your life, the way an entire base almost missed me. A hand went up in the back, a young cadet nervous. Ma'am, he said, if you'd stayed hidden, if you hadn't walked into that control center, what would have happened? Emily Carter looked at the young man for a long moment. The base would have fallen, she said simply. The pilots in that exercise would have died. Amanda Reyes would have died, and I would have gone home that night and cleaned my apartment and told myself it wasn't my fault that I was just the janitor, that no one could have expected me to do anything. Her voice dropped, and I would have known I was lying. For the rest of my life, I would have known that I had the ability to save them, and I chose to hide instead. That's the second lesson, and it's for the quiet ones, the humble ones, the ones like me. She looked around the room. Humility is a beautiful thing until it becomes an excuse. Do not let your modesty talk you out of the room when the room needs what you have. The world does not need you to be small. When people are dying and you have the ability to help, being humble is just cowardice wearing a nicer coat. Stand up, walk into the room, do the thing only you can do, every single time. She let the silence sit, and then Emily Carter, the former janitor, the ghost pilot, the woman who had come back from the dead to save hundreds, and then chosen to spend the rest of her life making sure the young ones never had to learn her lessons. The way she'd learned them gave her students the last and truest thing she knew. I lost 11 people I loved in a sky over a country I can't name, she said quietly. And for 4 years I let that loss convince me to disappear. But I was wrong, because the way you honor the dead, it is not by hiding from the sky that took them. It's by getting back in it and flying better and teaching the next ones to fly better still, so that fewer people have to lose what I lost. Her eyes moved across every face in the room, and there was steel in them, and there was love, and there was the whole weight of a life spent doing the impossible for other people. You are going to be the reason someone's daughter comes home. You are going to be the voice on the radio that keeps a frightened pilot calm. You are going to be the one who walks into the room when everyone else is too scared. That is the king. That is the only job. Everything else, the chores, the medals, the swagger, is noise. She stood at the front of that classroom, small and gray and utterly unbreakable. Now, let's begin, because I intend to make every one of you better than I ever was, and I do not intend to lose a single one of you along the way. Years passed, and Phantom Shadow became a name every pilot in the Air Force knew again, not for a mission in a sky no one could speak of, but for the classroom at the academy, where the greatest combat pilot who ever lived poured herself day after day into the young ones. Her students went on to fly all over the world, and when the sky turned bad, when everything went dark and the fear crept in, they heard her voice in their heads, calm and warm, and without fear, telling them they were going to be all right, telling them to think about the other people. First, telling them to walk into the room. Some of them saved lives that never knew their names. And every one of those saved lives traced back in a line only Emily Carter could see to a woman who had once pushed a mop down a quiet corridor while arrogant boys laughed. Jason Miller made Major, then Colonel, and he never once for the rest of his career walked past a person in a gray uniform without stopping to look them in the eye, because he had learned the hard way on a tarmac in front of a whole base that you never know who is standing beside you. Amanda Reyes took command of her own squadron, and on the wall of her office she hung a single photograph, not of an aircraft, but of a small gray-haired woman standing at the front of a classroom, and beneath it, 4 words: "The pilot who saved me." And on a quiet morning at the academy, an old sergeant named Ellis, retired, now brought his grandchildren to watch a demonstration flight. And he pointed up at the sky at a formation of young pilots flying with a precision and a discipline and a care for one another that did not happen by accident. And he told his grandchildren the story of the janitor, and every word of it was true. They had judged a woman by her uniform instead of her character. They had mistaken her silence for weakness and her humility for the absence of worth. They had looked at the quietest person in the room and seen nobody at all, and she had turned out to be the greatest story any of them would ever tell. Because a legend does not disappear when the world stops looking. A legend simply waits patient and quiet, pushing a cart down an empty corridor until the day the sky fills with enemies and the alarms begin to scream, and a base full of frightened people finally desperately needs the very person they never bothered to see. And on that day, the legend sets down the mop and walks into the room and reminds the whole world of a truth it should never have forgotten. The quietest person in the room is very often carrying the greatest story you will ever hear. So look at them, learn their name, and never ever underestimate the one standing beside you. Emily Carter never flew another combat mission. She never needed to. She had already given the sky everything it would ever ask of her. And then she gave it something greater still. She gave it 1,000 pilots who would carry her lessons for the rest of their lives, and every one of them made the sky a little safer and a little kinder and a little more worthy of the 11 friends she never stopped carrying. The janitor nobody noticed became the teacher no one would ever forget, and that in the end was the greatest mission Phantom Shadow ever flew.